Imagine a flat land. Not a dramatic land. Not a land of mountains and gorges and cliffs falling into the sea. This is a land that lies down. A wide, low, level plain, stretching away under an enormous sky, in every direction you can turn. So flat that a person standing on the ground can see the curve of the earth at the edge of the world, and so open that the wind moves across it without anything to stop it, all the way from the mountains in the north to the warm, shallow waters of the Gulf in the south. It is a land made of mud. That is the first thing to understand about it. This is not rock and not sand and not the thin, stony soil of the highlands. This is silt. Fine, soft, fertile silt, laid down grain by grain over hundreds of thousands of years by two great rivers that come down out of the mountains carrying the ground-up substance of half a continent and spread it across the plain in flood after flood after flood. The land beneath your feet was once the side of a mountain 1,000 kilometers away. The rivers brought it here, particle by particle, and dropped it, and built, slowly, patiently, across geological time, the flattest, richest, strangest land in the ancient world. The two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the land between them, and the land at their mouth where they wander toward the sea through a maze of marshes and reed beds and shifting channels, is the land the Greeks would much later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. But that name is not its name. Not yet. The people who lived here, who made here something that had never been made anywhere on the surface of the earth before, called the southern part of this plain by a word we render, imperfectly, as Sumer. And it is the people of Sumer whose story we are going to tell tonight. It is some evening more than 5,000 years ago. The sun is going down over the marshes, enormous and red, sinking into a horizon so flat that it seems to take a very long time about it. The air is warm and thick, and smells of water and mud, and the green of growing reeds, and the smoke of cooking fires. Frogs are beginning their evening chorus in the shallows. Somewhere a dog barks. Somewhere a child is called in from play, and rising out of the flat land, dark against the reddening sky, there is a shape that should not be there. A shape that no eye in the world had ever seen before this place, and this people invented it. A city, walls of mud brick, rising sheer from the plain. A great platform, a built mountain, lifting a temple toward the gods. Streets and houses packed close together, thousands of them, tens of thousands of people living within sight and sound and smell of one another. More people gathered in one place than had ever been gathered in one place in the history of the human species. This is Uruk, the first true city in the world, and it stands at the very beginning of the story. Not just the story of Sumer, but the story of all of us, because almost everything that we mean when we use the word civilization was invented here, on this flat, muddy plain, by these people, in the centuries we are about to walk through together. The wheel, the plough, the sail, the city, the written word, the school, the law code, the library, the temple tower, the first epic poem, the first named author in human history, the division of the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees, the idea that a king might owe something to his people, and the idea that a god might be argued with. The first written joke, the first written lullaby, the first written list of kings, stretching back, the Sumerians believed, into a time before the flood. They did all of this first. They did it before Egypt built a single pyramid. They did it before there was such a thing as China or India or Greece or Rome, in any form we would recognize. They did it when most of humanity, across most of the earth, was still living in scattered villages, or wandering after the herds, and when the very idea of a city, of so many strangers living together under one set of rules, was as new and as strange and as world-altering as anything our own age has ever produced. They were the first. And then, like all civilizations, they ended. Their language died out of everyday speech and became a dead tongue studied only by scholar priests. The Latin of the ancient world, kept alive in temples for 2,000 years after the last person had spoken it as a mother tongue. Their cities filled with silt and crumbled back into the mud they had been raised from, until they were nothing but low brown mounds on the empty plain, called by the wandering Bedouin only tells, the word for a hill made by human hands and forgotten. Their gods were renamed, absorbed, half-remembered, and finally lost. Their kings became legends, and then less than legends, and the world forgot, for more than 2,000 years, that they had ever existed at all, until, in the 1800s, in the great age of discovery and decipherment, Men with shovels and notebooks and an almost reckless determination began to dig into those low brown mounds, and out of the mud, out of the silt that had buried them, the first civilization on Earth, slowly, astonishingly, came back into the light. Tonight, we are going to tell their story. The whole story. From the first farmers who learned, somehow, to tame the violent, unpredictable rivers and turn the empty marsh into the most productive farmland in the ancient world, to the rise of the great cities and the invention of writing, through the gods and the kings and the wars and the trade, through the Epic of Gilgamesh and the royal tombs of and the priestess poet Enheduanna and the conqueror Sargon, to the long, slow ending and the lament that a Sumerian poet wrote for a fallen city, which is one of the oldest expressions of grief in human language, and finally to the legacy, to the astonishing fact that we, tonight, in our own world, are still living inside structures of thought and time and measurement and story that these people built on a muddy plain 5,000 years ago and more. But before we begin, I want to invite you to do something. Let your body settle. Wherever you are, in your bed, on your couch, in the dark with the day finally behind you, let yourself sink down into the support beneath you, the way the silt sinks down and settles at the bottom of still water after a flood. Let go of whatever you carried into this evening, the unfinished tasks, the conversation you keep replaying, the small accumulated weight of a day, of a week, of a life lived at the speed our lives are lived. You have carried it far enough. You can put it down now. For the next few hours, you do not have to hold anything. You can let someone else carry the story. That is what stories are for. That is what they have always been for. The Sumerians knew this. On the long evenings of their winters, when the work of the fields was done and the cold came down over the marshes, they gathered in the dark and they told stories. And we will never know most of those stories because they spoke them aloud and the words went into the air and were gone. But we are doing tonight what they did then. We are sitting together in the dark, letting a story carry us. Tell me where you are tonight. What does the air feel like where you are listening? Is it warm or cold? Is it raining or still or windy? Can you hear water anywhere? A river, the rain, the sea, a tap left running somewhere in the house? Leave a comment below, because somewhere in the world right now, in a dozen countries, on every continent, under skies of a dozen different colors, other people are lying in the dark, listening to this same story, settling toward the same sleep, and there is something quietly beautiful in being reminded that we are all doing this together, that we always have been, that 5,000 years ago, on the flat land between the rivers, people were doing it too. Now, breathe slowly. Let the warm air of the southern plains settle over you. Let the frogs sing in the marshes and the great red sun go down over the reeds. We are going back, far back, further back than almost any story can take you, back to the very beginning of the thing we call civilization, to the place where it was first invented, by people whose names we mostly do not know, in a language we spent 2,000 years forgetting, and then 100 years learning to read again. We are going to the land between the rivers. The story of Sumer does not begin with cities. It does not begin with ziggurats or kings or written words, or any of the things we associate with the name. It begins, as all human stories begin if you follow them back far enough, with the land itself, and with the slow, patient, almost unimaginably long process by which the land was made. So let us begin there, with the making of the ground. The plain of southern Mesopotamia is one of the youngest landscapes in the inhabited world. This is a strange thing to say about a place so ancient in human terms, but it is true. The land itself, the actual physical ground, is recent. It was built, and is still being built, by the two rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates both rise in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, in the high country of snow and rock where the winter precipitation of an entire region is stored and then released, every spring, in a great surge of meltwater. The rivers carry that water south, and they carry with it an enormous burden of sediment, silt and clay and fine sand, scoured from the mountains and the foothills, ground fine by the tumbling water, suspended in the current as a kind of liquid earth. As the rivers come down out of the highlands and reach the flat country, they slow. And when a river slows, it drops what it is carrying. The heavier particles fall out first, then the lighter ones, and over hundreds of thousands of years this constant deposition has built up the great alluvial plain, a wedge of fertile sediment hundreds of kilometers long, growing southward into the Gulf, layer upon layer upon layer, until the original floor of the valley lies buried under an immense thickness of river-borne mud. This is the land the Sumerians lived on. Not rock with a thin skin of soil, as in most of the world, but soil all the way down, deep, fine, fertile, almost frighteningly rich. It was, potentially, the best farmland in the entire ancient world. Potentially, because the gift came with a curse, and the gift and the curse were the same thing. The rivers. In a country like Egypt, the great river, the Nile, floods with a beautiful, reliable, almost gentle regularity. It rises in late summer, every year, at almost the same time, to almost the same level, deposits its fertile silt, and recedes. The Egyptians could set their calendar by it. They could trust it. The Nile was a kindness that arrived on schedule. The Tigris and the Euphrates were not kind, and they were not on schedule. They flooded in the spring, when the mountain snows melted, which is to say, after the winter crops had already been planted and were ripening in the fields, and just before they were ready to harvest. The flood, in other words, came at exactly the wrong time, and it came unpredictably. Some years it was gentle, some years it was catastrophic, a wall of water that burst the banks and drowned the fields and swept away the villages and changed, sometimes, the very course of the river, so that a town that had stood on the bank of the Euphrates for generations might find itself, after a single violent spring, stranded kilometers from any water at all. While the river ran its new course through what had been somebody else's desert, the rivers were powerful, willful, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. Everything depended on them. And so the first and greatest achievement of the people of this land, the achievement on which everything else was built, was learning to control them. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before there was anyone to control the rivers, there had to be people. And the people came, as people so often do, from somewhere else. The first human beings to settle the Mesopotamian plain came, the evidence suggests, down from the surrounding higher country, from the foothills of the Zagros Mountains to the east and north, where the long, slow revolution we call the Neolithic had already been underway for thousands of years. In those foothills, in a broad arc of well-watered upland that scholars call the Fertile Crescent, human beings had first learned, around 10,000 years before our era, to do the thing that would change everything, to plant seeds deliberately and harvest the crop, to keep animals rather than hunt them, to settle in one place and farm. This was the Neolithic Revolution, and it is, arguably, the single most important thing that has ever happened in the history of our species. More important than any war, any empire, any invention since. It was the moment when human beings stopped following their food and started growing it. And once that happened, everything else became possible. Settled life, surplus, population growth, specialization, the whole long road that leads, eventually, to cities and writing and us. For thousands of years, the farmers of the Fertile Crescent lived in the uplands, where the rain fell reliably enough to water their crops without help. The plain below, the hot, flat, riverine country to the south, was largely empty of farmers. It was too dry for rain-fed agriculture. In the south, in the heart of what would become Sumer, the annual rainfall was, and is, almost nothing. A few centimeters, falling in the winter, nowhere near enough to grow a crop of grain. To a people who knew only how to farm with rain, the southern plain was a wasteland, a sun-blasted expanse of dust and marsh and salt, useless, uninhabitable, ignored. And yet the southern plain had something the uplands did not. It had the rivers. It had, running through the middle of that dry, useless country, two enormous ribbons of water and fertile silt. And somewhere, at some point we cannot precisely date, but which lies deep in the 6th or 7th millennium before our era, somebody had the idea, the world-altering, civilization-founding idea, of bringing the water of the rivers to the dry land beside them. Irrigation. It sounds so simple, said like that. You dig a channel from the river to the field, and the water flows along it, and the dry land becomes wet, and the seed grows. But think for a moment about what it actually required. It required understanding the lay of an almost perfectly flat land well enough to know which way water would flow, to find the imperceptible gradients, the slight slopes invisible to the eye, along which a channel could be cut, so that the water would run where you wanted it to go, and not pool uselessly, or run back into the river. It required digging, enormous amounts of digging, by hand in the heat, moving tons and tons of earth to cut canals that might run for kilometers. It required maintaining those canals against the constant tendency of the silt-laden water to clog them, so that every year, before the growing season, the whole community had to turn out and clear the channels of the mud that had settled in them. It required building and maintaining the banks and the dikes and the regulators, the small dams and gates that controlled how much water went where. And above all, it required cooperation on a scale that had never been necessary before. This is the crucial point, and it is worth dwelling on, because it explains so much of what Sumer became. A single family, a single village, could farm with rain. But you cannot irrigate alone. A canal serves many fields, many families, many villages. It must be dug by many hands and maintained by many hands, and, this is the key, it must be shared, fairly, according to some agreed system, or it becomes a source of endless conflict. Who gets the water first? How much can each field take? Who is responsible for clearing which stretch of channel? What happens in a drought, when there is not enough water for everyone? What happens in a flood, when the channels must be closed to keep the water out? Irrigation, in other words, forced people to organize. It forced them to develop systems of cooperation and authority and dispute resolution far beyond anything a village of rain farmers ever needed. It rewarded the communities that could organize themselves well, and punished, with hunger, the ones that could not. And over the long centuries of the Southern Plains settlement, this constant pressure, the relentless need to coordinate the management of water across a whole landscape, was steadily, invisibly, shaping the people of Sumer into something new, into the kind of people who could build a city, into the kind of people who needed one. The earliest farmers we can clearly identify in the southern plain belong to what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, named, as so many archaeological periods are, after the unremarkable site where their distinctive pottery was first recognized, a small mound called Tel al-Ubaid, near the great city of Ur. The Ubaid culture flourished, roughly from before 6,000 to around 3,800 years before our era, an immense span, 2,000 years and more, during which the people of the plain slowly perfected the art of living off the irrigated land. The Ubaid people were farmers and herders and fishers and fowlers. They grew barley and wheat and dates. They kept sheep and goats and cattle. In the marshes, the great wetlands at the river's mouth, a world of reeds and water and astonishing abundance of fish and birds, they hunted and fished and harvested the reeds that they used for everything, for building, for boats, for baskets, for mats, for fuel. They built their houses of mud brick and of reed, and they built, at the center of their villages, something that tells us a great deal about the direction in which their world was moving. They built temples at the site of Eridu, which the later Sumerians themselves believed to be the very first city, the oldest city in the world, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Archaeologists digging down through the layers found a remarkable thing. They found a sequence of temples, built one on top of another, in the same place, over thousands of years, and above it, built directly on its ruins, a slightly larger temple, and above that, larger still, and so on, up through the layers of centuries, each temple raised on the levelled remains of the one before, each grander than the last, until at the top of the sequence we reach the great temples of the historic Sumerian period, and finally, the soaring brick mountain of the ziggurat. That sequence at Eridu is one of the most eloquent things in all of archaeology. It tells us that for thousands of years, in this one spot, generation after generation of people considered this place sacred, that the holiness of the site was passed down, unbroken, across an almost unimaginable span of time, so that a temple built when writing was still 2,000 years in the future, stood on the same consecrated ground as a temple built when Sumer was at its height. The god of Eridu was the god Enki, the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of cleverness and craft and magic. And the people of Eridu kept his house, and rebuilt it and made it grander, for so long that the keeping of it became one of the deepest continuities in the human record. The temple, in Sumer, was never going to be merely a place of worship. From the very beginning, it was the center of the village, then of the town, then of the city. It was where the surplus was gathered, where the records were kept, where the organization that irrigation demanded was concentrated and made visible, and given divine authority. The god owned the land, in the Sumerian understanding. The people were the god's tenants and servants, and the temple was the god's house, and the god's storehouse, and the god's administrative headquarters all at once. When we look, later, at the astonishing economic and bureaucratic machinery of the Sumerian city, we are looking at something that grew, organically, out of these little Ubaid shrines, out of the slow accumulation of holiness and authority and stored grain in one sacred spot across 2,000 years. Through the long Ubaid centuries, the population of the southern plain grew. The villages multiplied, and some of them grew into towns. The irrigation systems expanded and grew more complex. The temples grew larger. Trade developed, for the plain, for all its fertility, lacked almost everything except mud and water and reeds and grain. And to pay for it, the plain had its one great surplus: grain, the produce of the irrigated fields, more grain than the people who grew it could eat. The first true agricultural surplus in human history, the foundation of everything. By the end of the Ubaid period, the pieces were all in place. The land had been tamed, more or less. The irrigation systems were working. The population was dense and growing. The temples were rich and powerful. The trade networks reached out across the ancient world. The social organization was complex and getting more so. Everything that would be needed was present. And then, around 3,800 years before our era, on the southern plain, the pace of change suddenly accelerated. The towns began to grow with extraordinary speed. People poured in from the countryside and from the smaller settlements, abandoning their villages, concentrating in a handful of rapidly swelling centers. And one of those centers grew faster and larger than any settlement had ever grown anywhere on Earth before. The world was about to invent the city. And the city it invented first was Uruk. There is a moment in the human story that has no parallel and no precedent, a threshold that once crossed could never be uncrossed. It is the moment when human beings first gathered together, in numbers beyond counting, beyond knowing, beyond the reach of any single person's acquaintance, and lived together as strangers. It is the invention of the city, and as far as we can tell, it happened first at Uruk. We must try to feel how strange this was. For the entire previous history of our species, for the hundreds of thousands of years that human beings and their ancestors had walked the earth, people had lived in groups small enough that everyone knew everyone. The band of hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic village, these were communities of, at most, a few hundred people, and usually far fewer, in which every individual was known to every other individual, in which your neighbors were your kin, in which the whole web of human relationship was something a single mind could hold and a single lifetime could encompass. You knew the people you lived among. You knew their faces and their names and their parents and their quarrels and their histories. There were no strangers. The city changed that, forever. In a city, you live surrounded by people you do not know, and will never know. You pass, in a single day, more human faces than your ancestors saw in a lifetime. The web of relationship becomes too large for any one mind to hold. And this living among strangers, this density of unknown others, required entirely new ways of organizing human life. It required rules that applied to everyone, because you could no longer rely on personal relationship to govern behavior. It required authority that could enforce those rules. It required ways of keeping track, of who owned what, who owed what, who was responsible for what, that did not depend on personal memory, because personal memory could no longer cope. It required, in the end, writing. The city and the written word were born together, of the same necessity, in the same place, within a few centuries of each other. They are twins. Uruk, at its height in the centuries around 3,100 years before our era, may have held 40,000 people, or 50,000, or more. The estimates vary, and the uncertainty is large, but the lowest plausible figures are already staggering for their time. There was nothing else like it on Earth. Egypt had not yet been unified. The great cities of the Indus had not yet risen. China was still a scatter of Neolithic villages. In the whole world, there was one place where tens of thousands of human beings lived packed together behind walls, and that place was Uruk, on the bank of a channel of the Euphrates, on the flat plain of southern Sumer. The city covered an enormous area, several square kilometers within its walls. Those walls themselves a marvel. Kilometers in circumference, built of millions of mud bricks, raised to keep out the floods and the raiders and to mark, unmistakably, the boundary between the city and everything that was not the city. Later Sumerian tradition credited the building of Uruk's walls to a king named Gilgamesh, and we will return to him, because his is the greatest story Sumer ever told. And the epic that bears his name begins and ends with those walls, with an invitation to the listener to climb them, and walk along their length, and marvel at the work of the king who built them. We will come to that. For now, simply hold the image. A great circuit of mud brick wall, enclosing a city of tens of thousands, rising out of the flat green plain. At the heart of Uruk were the temples, and here the scale becomes almost difficult to believe. The Uruk period builders raised temple complexes of monumental size on great platforms, decorated in ways that show a command of resources and labor far beyond anything seen before. There was the precinct of Iana, the house of heaven, sacred to the goddess Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and the morning and evening star, the most vivid and most dangerous and most fascinating deity in the whole Sumerian pantheon, of whom we will hear a great deal. And there was the precinct sacred to the sky god An. The temples of Uruk were the largest buildings in the world. They were decorated with thousands upon thousands of small clay cones, their ends painted red and black and white, pressed into the mud plaster of the walls in geometric patterns, a kind of mosaic, durable and brilliant, covering whole facades and columns in shimmering design. To stand before those temples, freshly built and freshly decorated, gleaming in the sun, must have been to feel that you stood at the center of the world. Which, in a sense, you did. How was such a thing built? How did a society of farmers, only recently emerged from the village, organize the labor of thousands to raise these monuments, to dig the canals, to maintain the city, to feed its tens of thousands of mouths? The answer is the temple economy. And it is one of the great Sumerian inventions, every bit as important as writing or the wheel. The temple, the god's household, had become, over the long Ubaid centuries, the great organizing institution of the community. It owned vast tracts of farmland. It employed, or supported, a large fraction of the population. Not just priests, but ploughmen and shepherds and fishermen and weavers and potters and smiths and brewers and bakers and scribes and overseers, all working, in some sense, for the god, all fed from the god's storehouses. The temple gathered in the agricultural surplus, stored it, and redistributed it, feeding the workers, supporting the specialists, financing the trade expeditions that brought in the stone and metal and timber the plain lacked. It was, in effect, a planned economy run out of a religious institution, a vast machine for collecting, storing, and distributing resources, organized around the worship and service of a god, and recorded. This is the crucial point. Recorded in writing, because an operation of this scale could not be run on memory. And so we come to the thing for which Uruk is most justly famous, the thing that more than any other marks the true beginning of recorded history. In the layers of the Ana precinct, dating to around 3,300 to 3,200 years before our era, archaeologists found the earliest writing in the world. We will spend a whole part of our story on writing, because it deserves it, because it is perhaps the single most consequential invention these people made. For now, simply understand what it was at the beginning. Not poetry, not prayer, not the boasts of kings, not history, not literature. The first writing was accounting. It was lists. It was records of how much grain went into the temple storehouse and how much came out. How many sheep, how many jars of beer, how many measures of barley, allotted to whom, owed by whom, received from whom. The first written documents in human history are receipts and ration lists and inventories, the dry, indispensable bookkeeping of the temple economy. The earliest texts are filled with tallies of commodities and the small pictographic signs that stood for them. A stylized head of grain, an ox head, a fish, a pot, numbers and things and numbers. The world's first literature was a spreadsheet. There is something wonderful in this. We imagine that civilization begins with grand gestures, with monuments, with epics, with the proclamations of kings. But the actual beginning, the actual reason writing was invented, was the humblest thing imaginable. Somebody needed to keep track of the barley. The temple was too big, the transactions too many, the strangers too numerous, for anyone to hold it all in their head. And so a scribe, some unnamed genius or, more likely, some long succession of unnamed problem solvers, worked out a way to make a mark in clay that would stand for a word, and hold its meaning, and still be there tomorrow, and the day after. And, though they could not have dreamed it, 5,000 years after, when we dug it up and learnt, slowly, to read it again, the Uruk period was an age of explosive invention, and writing was only one of its achievements. It was in these centuries, or thereabouts, that the potter's wheel came into use, the fast wheel, spun to throw a vessel quickly and evenly, allowing mass production of standardized pottery, much of it produced, it seems, to serve as ration containers in the temple economy. The famous beveled rim bowl of the Uruk period, a crude, mold-made, mass-produced little bowl, found by the tens of thousands across the whole Uruk world, was very likely a standard measure for distributing rations of grain or bread or porridge to the temple's workers. The world's first disposable cup, in a sense. The archaeology of early Uruk is littered with them, discarded, broken, by the thousand. the physical residue of a society feeding its workforce on an industrial scale. It was in this period, too, that the wheel itself, the wheel for transport, the wheeled vehicle, came into use in Mesopotamia, one of the places where it was first invented, and the plough, drawn by oxen, which let a few people work a great deal of land, and the sail, which let boats move up the rivers against the current and across the gulf, dramatically extending the reach of trade, and the cylinder seal, a small carved cylinder of stone that, rolled across wet clay, left a continuous impressed image, used to mark and authenticate documents and sealed containers, a personal signature in stone, and incidentally one of the great miniature art forms of the ancient world. This burst of innovation did not stay in Uruk. The Uruk world expanded, culturally, commercially, perhaps in some places politically, across an astonishing range. Uruk-style material culture, Uruk-style architecture, Uruk-style administrative technology spread up the rivers and across the surrounding regions, into the north of Mesopotamia, into the Iranian highlands, into Syria and Anatolia. Trading colonies or outposts in the Uruk style appear far from the southern plain. Scholars argue about exactly what this expansion was: colonization, trade, emulation, cultural diffusion, some combination, but its reality is not in doubt. For a few centuries, the influence of the southern Sumerian city radiated outward across a huge swath of the ancient Near East. It was the first time a single cultural and economic system had reached so far. It was, in a sense, the first time the world had a center. What was it like to live in Uruk at its height? We can only partly imagine, but we can imagine something. It was crowded. It was loud. It smelled of smoke and animals and sewage and the river and baking bread and brewing beer. It was hot, blazingly hot in summer, the sun coming down on the mud-brick streets with a weight that drove people indoors in the middle of the day. The streets were narrow and winding and unpaved, the houses crowded against one another, flat-roofed, blank-walled toward the street, opening inward onto small courtyards where the life of the household went on. Above the low roofs of the ordinary city rose the great platforms and the gleaming cone mosaic temples, visible from everywhere, the constant reminder of the god whose city this was. Down at the harbour, for Uruk, like the other Sumerian cities, was a river port. Boats came and went, reed boats and wooden boats, bringing grain in from the country and goods in from distant lands, carrying the textiles and the manufactured goods of the city out to be traded. There were rich and poor, and the distance between them was already vast. There were the great households, of the temple, and increasingly of the palace, as kingship developed, with their estates and their dependents and their stores of luxury goods. And there were the labourers, the ones who ate from the beveled rim bowls, who dug the canals and carried the bricks and worked the temple fields, whose lives were short and hard and almost entirely invisible to us, recorded only as numbers in ration lists. So many men, so many measures of barley. The city made wealth on a scale never before possible, and the city made inequality on a scale never before possible. Both of these are part of the Sumerian inheritance, and both of them are still with us. And there was beauty, and pleasure, and meaning, woven through all of it. There was the beer that the Sumerians loved, and brewed in great quantity, and drank, often through long reed straws from a communal jar, a scene shown again and again in their art. There was music, and feasting, and the great festivals of the gods, when the whole city gathered, and the divine images were carried in procession, and the year was renewed. There was the marriage of the goddess, reenacted in ritual, the sacred union on which the fertility of the land was thought to depend. There was love. We have Sumerian love poetry, some of the oldest in the world, and it is tender and frank and immediate and utterly recognizable across 5,000 years. There was the simple, profound satisfaction of being a citizen of the greatest city in the world, in the only place in the world where such a thing as a city existed. This was Uruk, the first of cities, the mother of cities, the place where the human species, for the first time, gathered itself together in such numbers and such density that it had to invent, out of sheer necessity, out of the pressure of all those strangers living side by side, the entire apparatus of civilized life: writing, law, bureaucracy, monumental architecture, planned economy, organized religion on a grand scale, the management of a complex society, all of it crystallized here, on the muddy plain, in these few astonishing centuries, and Uruk was only the first. As the centuries passed, and the Uruk age gave way to what scholars call the early dynastic period, the southern plain filled with cities, not one great center anymore, but a whole landscape of them, each with its walls and its temple and its god and increasingly its king. And Eridu and Lagash and Umma and Nippur and Kish and Shuruppak and Larsa and Adab and Sippar and more, each a world unto itself, each proud, ancient, jealous of its independence, devoted to its own god. Together they made up the land of Sumer, the first civilization on earth, the bright, crowded, quarrelsome, brilliant world that we are going to spend the rest of this long night exploring. But before we walk through their streets and meet their gods and kings, we have to tell another story first. The story of how all of this, buried, forgotten, lost for more than 2,000 years, was found again. For more than 2,000 years, the Sumerians did not exist. This is one of the strangest facts in the whole history of human knowledge, and it is worth pausing to absorb it. The first civilization on earth, the people who invented the city and the written word, who built Uruk and who told the story of Gilgamesh and wrote the laws and counted the stars, vanished so completely from human memory that for 2 millennia nobody knew they had ever lived. The Greeks, who knew a great deal about the ancient world and who wrote the histories from which Europe long took its picture of the past, knew nothing of Sumer. They knew of Babylon and of Assyria, the later Mesopotamian empires, which still existed, in some form, within Greek historical memory. Herodotus visited Babylon, or said he did, and described its wonders. But behind Babylon and Assyria, stretching back another 2,000 years and more, lay the Sumerian world from which those later empires had themselves descended, and of that older world, the deepest root of Mesopotamian civilization, the Greeks had no idea at all. It was already, in their time, unimaginably ancient and entirely forgotten. The Bible, too. Preserved fragments, distorted, half-remembered, transmuted into sacred story. The Tower of Babel is a memory of the ziggurat, the great brick temple tower of Babylon, itself descended from the Sumerian ziggurats. The story of the flood, Noah and the ark, and the waters covering the earth, is, we now know, a version of a story the Sumerians told 2,000 years before the Hebrew scriptures were written, a story we can read in their own clay tablets, in a form astonishingly close to the biblical one. Abraham, the patriarch, is said in Genesis to have come from Ur of the Chaldees, and that Ur was a real city, one of the greatest of the Sumerian cities, though by Abraham's traditional time it was already old. The memory of Sumer was buried inside the Bible, encoded in its oldest stories, but unrecognized, unidentified, its source unknown for thousands of years. And in Mesopotamia itself, on the plain where the cities had stood, there was nothing to see but the tells, the mounds. When a mud brick city is abandoned, it does not leave ruins of the dramatic kind that stone leaves. Mud brick dissolves. The rain and the wind and the seasons melt it slowly back into the earth it was made from, and the wind-blown silt covers it, and the whole great city sinks down and rounds off and becomes, over centuries, a low brown hill, a tell, humped against the flat horizon, indistinguishable, to the untrained eye, from a natural rise in the ground. The plain of southern Iraq is dotted with these mounds. The Arabs who lived among them gave them names and grazed their flocks around them and built their villages near them, and knew, in a general way, that they were old and man-made. But what lay inside them, that they had been cities, that they had been the first cities, that beneath the brown silt lay the foundations of human civilization, nobody knew. The rediscovery of this lost world is one of the great adventures of the human intellect, and it has 2 intertwined strands. One strand is the spade, the physical excavation of the buried cities. The other is the code, the decipherment of the lost scripts, the cracking of the strange wedge-shaped writing that covered the artifacts the spade brought up. Both strands run through the 19th century, and they reinforced each other. Every excavation produced more inscriptions to decipher, and every advance in decipherment made the excavations more meaningful. Together, across a few astonishing decades, they brought the dead back to life. Let us begin with the code, because the script was visible long before anyone dug seriously for the cities. For centuries, European travelers in the Near East had noticed, here and there, strange inscriptions, on the ruins of Persepolis, the great palace city of the Persian kings, on bricks and stones brought back from the mounds of Mesopotamia, carved into cliff faces. The writing was unlike any known script. It was made up entirely of wedges, small wedge-shaped marks, pressed into clay or carved into stone, arranged in clusters, pointing in different directions. The Latin word for wedge is cuneus, and so the script came to be called cuneiform. Wedge writing. Nobody could read a word of it. Nobody knew what language or languages it recorded, or even whether the wedges were letters or syllables or whole words. It was a complete enigma, a wall of meaningless marks left by a vanished world. The first great breakthrough came not from Mesopotamia, but from Persia, and it came through a combination of patient scholarship and sheer physical daring that has made one name famous above the rest: Henry Creswick Rawlinson. Rawlinson was a British army officer, posted to Persia in the 1830s, a man of restless energy and formidable intelligence and almost reckless courage. In the mountains of western Persia, on the road between Babylon and the Persian highlands, there is a great cliff called Bisitan, and high up on the face of that cliff, more than 100 meters above the ground, the Persian king Darius the Great had, around 500 years before our era, carved an enormous inscription celebrating his victories. The inscription was in 3 languages, all written in cuneiform: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, the late descendant of the Sumerian-derived writing system. 3 versions of the same text, in 3 languages, like the later Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the Behistun inscription was carved 100 meters up a sheer cliff, deliberately placed beyond easy reach so that no one could deface it. To copy it, Rawlinson had to climb, and climb he did, over several years, hanging from ropes and ladders on the cliff face, perched on narrow ledges, copying the wedges one by one, sometimes lowering himself or being lowered down the rock. At one point, the famous story, bridging a gap to reach the most inaccessible panel by employing a local boy to scale a part of the cliff that Rawlinson himself could not, hammer pegs into cracks, and take impressions of the inscription with wet paper. It was scholarship as mountaineering, decipherment as a feat of physical nerve, with the Old Persian portion, the simplest of the 3 scripts, with the fewest signs, as his foothold, and building on the work of other scholars across Europe who were wrestling with the same problem. Rawlinson and his contemporaries slowly, painstakingly cracked the code. The Old Persian yielded first. Then, using the trilingual nature of the inscription, scholars worked their way into the Babylonian. And the Babylonian was the key, because Babylonian was a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, and once it began to give up its secrets, the whole vast world of Mesopotamian writing began to open. The decipherment of Babylonian cuneiform in the middle of the 19th century was one of the supreme intellectual achievements of the age. So extraordinary did it seem that many doubted it. Surely, the skeptics said, no one could truly read this dead wedge writing. The so-called decipherers were fooling themselves. And so, in a famous test in 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society in London sent copies of a newly discovered inscription, sealed, to 4 of the leading scholars, asking each to translate it independently, without consulting the others. When the sealed translations were opened and compared, they agreed. The 4 scholars, working separately, had produced substantially the same translation of a text that no human being had been able to read for 2,000 years. Cuneiform was cracked. The dead languages could be read again, but the script the scholars had learned to read was Babylonian and Assyrian, the later Semitic languages of Mesopotamia. As they read more and more tablets, they began to notice something puzzling. Many of the texts contained passages and signs and whole documents that were not in Babylonian at all, that were in some other, older language entirely, a language that was not Semitic, not related to anything the scholars knew. The Babylonians themselves had clearly regarded this older language as sacred and learned, the way medieval Europeans regarded Latin. They wrote dictionaries and grammars and bilingual texts to help themselves understand it. They studied it in their schools. It was, plainly, the ancestral language of their civilization, older than Babylonian, the tongue in which the oldest texts had been written, the original language of Mesopotamian culture. A few scholars, putting these clues together, made a bold proposal, that behind the Babylonians and Assyrians there had been an even older people who had invented the writing and founded the civilization, and whose language survived in these sacred ancient texts. The proposal was controversial. Some insisted there had been no such people, that the other language was just a priestly code or a cryptic form of Babylonian. But the evidence mounted, and the older people, the original people, were eventually accepted as real. They needed a name. The Babylonians had called the southern land Sumer, and so the lost original people came to be called the Sumerians. So the Sumerians were, in a sense, deduced before they were dug up, inferred from the structure of the writing system and the testimony of the later Babylonians. recovered as a kind of necessary hypothesis to explain the deepest layer of Mesopotamian culture. And then the spade caught up with the code, and the inference became flesh. The great age of Mesopotamian excavation began in the 1840s, when European diplomats and adventurers, the Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta, the Englishman Austin Henry Layard, began digging into the enormous mounds of northern Mesopotamia near Mosul and uncovered the palaces of the Assyrian kings, vast complexes lined with carved stone reliefs of breathtaking power, guarded by colossal human-headed winged bulls, their walls covered in cuneiform. The finds were sensational. They poured into the museums of Europe, the British Museum, the Louvre, and they made the ancient Near East, for the first time, vividly, physically present to the Western imagination. The Assyrian kings, known before only as shadowy villains in the Bible, suddenly stood revealed in stone, in all their terrible magnificence. And among the finds from the Assyrian palaces was something even more precious than the sculpture. At the city of Nineveh, in the ruined palace of the last great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, the excavators found the remains of a library, a royal library, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, the king's deliberate collection of the accumulated written wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization. Ashurbanipal had been a literate king, a rarity, proud of his learning, and he had sent scribes throughout his empire to copy and collect the texts of the past. The omens, the rituals, the medical texts, the lexical lists, the myths, the epics. When his palace burned in the destruction of Nineveh, the fire baked the clay tablets hard, and so the catastrophe that ended his empire preserved his library, hardened and shattered but readable, for the archaeologists who would dig it up more than 2,000 years later. It was in the broken tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, in the British Museum, that one of the most dramatic moments in the whole rediscovery took place. In the 1870s, a young self-taught scholar named George Smith, a man of humble origins who had taught himself cuneiform while working as an engraver, and who had a genius for the script, was working through the unsorted fragments. And on one broken tablet, he began to read a story. It was a story of a great flood, sent by the gods to destroy mankind, of a man warned by a god to build a great boat, of the man loading aboard his family and the animals, of the boat coming to rest, after the waters receded, on a mountain, of the man sending out birds to find dry land. It was the story of Noah's flood, but it was not from the Bible. It was 1,000 years older than the oldest part of the Bible, written in cuneiform, on a clay tablet from the library of an Assyrian king, part of a great Babylonian epic. The story of the flood, that foundational story of the Western religious tradition, turned out to have a Mesopotamian original, far more ancient. The legend has it that when George Smith, reading these lines for the first time, realized what he had found, he leapt up in the quiet room of the British Museum, and, in the staid telling of the period, in his excitement began to undress himself, tearing at his clothes in a kind of ecstasy of discovery. Whatever exactly happened, the discovery was a sensation. When Smith announced it publicly, the public response was so great that a newspaper funded an expedition to send him to Nineveh to look for the missing fragments of the story. And, against all odds, almost immediately upon digging, he found them. The flood tablet electrified the world and made it clear, beyond any doubt, that the buried tablets of Mesopotamia contained not just the dry accounts of bureaucrats, but literature, myth, epic, the deepest stories of the human past, including the stories that had flowed into the Bible itself. The excavation of the specifically Sumerian cities, the deepest, oldest layer, came somewhat later, as archaeologists pushed south from Assyria into the heart of the old Sumerian plain. The French dug at Lagash, at the mound of Tello, from the 1870s onward, recovering thousands of tablets, and the first great corpus of Sumerian language documents, and the famous statues of the ruler Gudea, carved in hard, dark stone, serene and devout, among the masterpieces of Sumerian art. The Americans dug at Nippur, the holy city of the god Enlil, the religious center of all Sumer, and recovered tens of thousands of tablets, including a great mass of Sumerian literary texts, the myths and hymns and epics in the original Sumerian language, the literature of the first civilization, which scholars are still editing and translating and piecing together to this day. And in the 1920s, at the city of Ur of the Chaldees, the Ur of Abraham, the English archaeologist Leonard Woolley conducted one of the most famous and most spectacular excavations in the history of the discipline, uncovering the Great Ziggurat and, beneath the city, the Royal Cemetery, with its astonishing treasures and its dark secrets. We will return to Woolley and to Ur, because what he found there deserves a part of its own. By the early 20th century then, the work of a few generations of climbers and diggers and decipherers had accomplished something almost miraculous. A civilization that had been utterly lost, forgotten so completely that its very existence had to be deduced before it could be found, had been restored to human memory. Its cities had been located and dug. Its art had been recovered and displayed. Its language had been deciphered. Its literature had begun to be read. The first chapter of the human story, blank for 2,000 years, was being written again, word by patient word, out of the clay. It is, when you stand back from it, an extraordinary thing. This resurrection of the dead by the living, this reaching back across 5,000 years to recover the voices of people who had been silent for so long that the world had forgotten they ever spoke. The Sumerians, who invented writing so that nothing important would be forgotten, had themselves been forgotten more thoroughly than almost any people in history. And it was writing, their own invention, the wedges in the clay, that brought them back. They wrote so that they would be remembered. For 2,000 years it did not work. And then, against all odds, it did. Now, with the cities found and the script deciphered, let us go in. Let us walk through a Sumerian city as it was when it was alive. Let us walk through a Sumerian city. We will walk through Ur, because Ur is the city we know best, the city Woolley excavated so thoroughly, with its houses and streets and temples and tombs, that we can reconstruct, more fully than for any other Sumerian city, what it was actually like to live there. And we will walk through it, not as it is now, a field of low ruins and the great restored bulk of the ziggurat rising from the desert plain, but as it was around 4,000 years ago, in the time of its greatest glory, when it was the capital of an empire and one of the richest cities in the world, and the canals were full of boats and the streets were full of people, and the smoke of 10,000 hearths rose into the enormous Mesopotamian sky. We approach by water, because that is how most people approached a Sumerian city. The land of Sumer was a land of waterways, the two great rivers and the countless canals that branched from them, and the canals were the roads. Goods moved by boat, people moved by boat. The city, like all the Sumerian cities, was a port, built beside a major channel, with harbours where the boats tied up. As we come down the canal toward Ur, the first thing we see, long before we reach the walls, is the ziggurat. It rises out of the flat land like a mountain, and that is exactly what it was meant to be, a built mountain in a land that had no mountains. The ziggurat of Ur, raised by the great king Ur-Nammu around 4,100 years before our era, was a vast stepped platform of solid mud brick, a lower stage perhaps 15 meters high and 60 meters long, with a second stage set back on top of it, and a third above that, and at the summit, a small temple, the actual dwelling of the god. The whole thing was faced with a skin of fired brick, baked brick, far more durable than the sun-dried mud brick of the core, set in bitumen, the natural tar that seeped from the ground in parts of Mesopotamia, and which the Sumerians used as mortar and waterproofing. 3 great staircases climbed the front of the lower stage, converging toward the upper levels, so that a procession could ascend in stately progress toward the god's house at the top. The ziggurat was sacred to Nana, also called Sin, the moon god, the great god of Ur, whose city this was, and there is something fitting in that. The moon ruled the Sumerian calendar. The months were lunar, beginning with the new moon, and the moon god was, in some traditions, the father of the sun god and of Inanna the morning star, a senior deity, wise and ancient. From the summit of his ziggurat, the highest point for many kilometers in any direction, the moon would have seemed very close, and the priests who climbed there in the night, to observe the moon and the stars and to attend the god, stood nearer to the heavens than any other people in the flat land below. Why build the god a mountain? The Sumerians, like many ancient peoples, associated the divine with height, with the mountains where the rivers were born, with the sky where the great gods dwelt. The gods of the highlands had their natural high places. The gods of the flat plain had to be given high places, built by human hands. The ziggurat lifted the god's house above the city, above the plain, toward the heavens, and lifted the worshipper, climbing toward it, part way out of the ordinary world toward the sacred one. It was a stairway between earth and sky, a meeting place of the human and the divine, and it is no accident that the biblical Tower of Babel, the tower that reached toward heaven, is a memory of exactly this kind of building. The ordinary city did not climb. It lay low around the ziggurat's great enclosure. Let us leave the sacred precinct, with its temples and its storehouses and its workshops and its priestly bureaucracy, and go down into the streets where the people lived. They are narrow, these streets, narrow and winding and unpaved, just packed earth, dusty in summer and muddy after the rare rain. They twist and turn. They are not laid out on any grid. They grew, over centuries, as the city grew, following the lines of older lanes and the boundaries of older houses, so that to walk them is to follow a logic that is the accumulated logic of generations, rather than the design of any planner. They are barely wide enough, in places, for a loaded donkey to pass. They have no drainage to speak of. Refuse is thrown into them, and trodden down, and built over, so that the street level rises, slowly, century by century, and the people periodically have to raise their thresholds and their floors to keep pace with the rising street outside. One of the reasons the cities became mounds, the ground level creeping upward as the debris of daily life accumulated underfoot. The houses turn blank walls to the street. This is the pattern of the hot lands, then and now. The house looks inward, not outward. From the street you see only a featureless mud brick wall, perhaps a single doorway, closed. But step through the doorway, and the house opens up around a central courtyard, open to the sky, the heart of the household. The rooms are arranged around this courtyard, the living rooms, the kitchen with its hearth and oven, the storerooms, the sleeping rooms, sometimes a second story reached by a stair, sometimes a reception room for guests. The courtyard lets in light and air, and lets out smoke. It is where much of the life of the household happens, where the cooking and the spinning and the children's play and the family's gathering all take place, under the open sky but within the walls, private, enclosed, turned away from the public street. Woolley excavated a whole neighborhood of such houses at Ur, and what they reveal is a substantial, comfortable, middle-class urban life. Merchants and priests and scribes and craftsmen living in well-built houses of a dozen rooms or more, with paved courtyards and plastered walls and household shrines and, beneath the floors, the graves of their ancestors, for the Sumerians often buried their dead beneath the floors of their own houses, keeping them close, within the family home. The living and the dead under one roof, the generations layered in the very ground the household walked on. There is something both strange and tender in this. The dead were not banished to a distant cemetery. They remained part of the household, fed with offerings, remembered, present beneath the feet of their descendants. In the streets and the courtyards, the life of the city goes on around us. Listen to it. There is the constant low background of a packed human settlement. Voices, footsteps, the bray of donkeys, the bleat of goats and sheep being driven through the streets, the bark of dogs, the cry of children. There is the sound of work, the potter's wheel turning, the weaver's loom clacking, the smith's hammer ringing on metal, the scrape and thud of the builders forever repairing the mud brick walls that the weather forever wears away. There is the sound of the grain being ground, for in every household, every day, women knelt at the grinding stones and ground the day's barley into flour. The rhythmic scrape of stone on stone and grain, hour after hour, the most universal and most relentless labor of the ancient world, the sound that underlay every meal. There is the smell of bread baking in the domed clay ovens, and of beer fermenting. For the Sumerians made enormous quantities of beer, thick and nourishing, a staple food as much as a drink, brewed from barley bread, drunk by everyone, offered to the gods. And there is, always, the smell of the river and the canals and the marshes, water and mud and reeds and fish, and the smoke, the omnipresent smoke of the cooking fires and the kilns and the lamps hanging over the city, catching the light of the enormous setting sun. The markets, though market may be the wrong word, for much of the Sumerian economy ran not through buying and selling for money, but through the redistributive systems of the temple and palace. The places of exchange were down by the harbour, where the boats came in. There, the produce of the country and the goods of distant lands changed hands. Grain and dates and dried fish and wool from the land of Sumer itself, and from far away, copper and tin to make bronze, gold and silver, timber and stone, lapis lazuli of deep heavenly blue from the mountains of distant Afghanistan, carnelian and other precious stones, ivory, aromatics, all the things the rich plain lacked and craved. The Sumerians had no coined money. That would not be invented for another 1,500 years. But they had standards of value, measured chiefly in weights of silver and in measures of barley, and they kept careful account of debts and prices and obligations, in writing, on clay. The harbour district was the most cosmopolitan part of the city, where merchants and sailors from up and down the rivers and across the Gulf came and went, speaking different tongues, bringing news and goods from the edges of the known world, and over all of it, dominating everything, visible from every street and every courtyard and every rooftop, stood the ziggurat and the temple precinct, the constant reminder that this was the god's city, that the god owned the land and the harvest and, in a sense, the people, that the whole prosperous, bustling life of the city existed within and depended upon the favor of the divine landlord whose house rose above the rooftops. The Sumerian city was, at its core, a theocracy, a city organized around the service of its god. And the great rhythms of the city's life were the rhythms of the god's worship, the daily offerings carried up to the temple, the monthly festivals of the new moon and the full moon, and above all the great annual festival of the new year, when the old year died and the new year was born, when the god's image was carried in procession, and the king renewed his sacred bond with the deity, and the fate of the coming year was decreed. At night, the city slept under a sky of extraordinary brilliance. We who live among electric lights have largely lost the night sky, but the Sumerians lived beneath it in its full glory. The stars in their thousands, the band of the Milky Way, the wandering planets, the moon in its phases, and they watched it with an attention and a precision that would in time lay the foundations of astronomy and astrology and the measurement of time itself. The flat land, with its huge unobstructed horizon and its clear dry air, was perhaps the best observatory in the ancient world, and the priests on the ziggurat, the moon god's servants, watched the heavens night after night, recording, calculating, searching the sky for the will of the gods written in the movements of the lights. We will come to what they learned. For now, simply see them, the dark city below, the few lamps glimmering, the great black bulk of the ziggurat, and above it the whole burning wheel of the heavens, turning, as the priests watched and the people slept, and the moon god, in his house at the summit, looked down on the first great city of the world. This was and what was true of was true, in its essentials, of all the cities of Sumer, Uruk and Lagash and Nippur and Eridu and Kish and the rest. Each had its walls, its harbour, its narrow winding streets and inward-looking houses, its ziggurat and temple precinct, its god, its rhythms of work and worship. Each was a little world, ancient and proud and self-contained, devoted to its own deity, jealous of its independence, suspicious of its neighbours. Together they made up the land of Sumer, the first urban civilization on Earth, a constellation of city-states scattered across the southern plain, bound together by a common language and a common culture and a common pantheon, and divided, endlessly, by the rivalries and the wars and the competition for land and water that were the dark underside of their brilliant crowded life. But the deepest and most consequential thing about these cities, the thing that more than any wall or ziggurat or harbour made them the first civilization and the parent of all that came after, was not anything you could see by walking through the streets. It was the small marks pressed into clay, the wedge writing, the thing the temple scribes did with their reed styluses, hunched over their tablets, recording and reckoning and, eventually, remembering. It is time to talk about writing. Of all the things the Sumerians gave the world, the greatest is writing. This is a large claim, and it deserves defending. They gave us the city, and the city is the foundation of civilized life. They gave us the wheel and the plough and the sail and monumental architecture and organized religion and law and 100 other things. But writing is the one that changed not just how we live, but what we are. Writing is the technology that lets a mind reach across time. It lets a person who died 5,000 years ago speak to a person alive tonight. It lets knowledge accumulate beyond the limit of any single memory, beyond the span of any single life, building up across the generations into the vast inherited store of learning that makes everything else possible. Without writing there is no science, no literature, no history, no law as we know it, no accumulated knowledge of any kind beyond what the living can carry in their heads and pass by mouth to the next generation. Writing is the thing that broke the prison of the present moment, and it was invented here, on the muddy plain, by these people, for the humblest of reasons. We have already glimpsed how it began, not as poetry or prayer, but as accounting. The temple economy of Uruk grew too large and too complex to be managed by memory, and so somebody invented a way to record it. But the road from those first records to true writing was long, and the steps along it are one of the most fascinating sequences in the human story, because we can actually trace them. We can watch, in the surviving clay, the human mind feeling its way, across centuries, toward the discovery of how to capture language itself. The road began, the evidence suggests, before clay tablets at all, with tokens. For thousands of years before writing, the people of the Near East had used small clay tokens of various shapes, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders, to keep count of things. A small cone might stand for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, a particular shape for a sheep, another for a jar of oil. To record a transaction, so much grain, so many sheep, you gathered the appropriate tokens, and to keep them together, and to make the record tamper-proof, you might seal them inside a hollow ball of clay, a clay envelope, a bulla, its surface impressed with the cylinder seals of the parties to mark it as authentic and unaltered. But there was an obvious problem with sealing the tokens inside an opaque ball. You could not see what was inside without breaking it open, and so people began, before breaking the ball, to impress the tokens into its still soft surface, or to draw the token shapes on the outside, a record, on the outside, of what was sealed within. And then, at some point, somebody had the decisive realization: if the marks on the outside record what is inside, you do not need the inside at all. You do not need the tokens. The marks alone are sufficient. Throw away the ball, keep the marks, press them into a flat tablet of clay. Let the marks themselves be the record. This is the threshold of writing, the moment when a mark stops being a thing that stands beside the count and becomes the count itself, a symbol, a sign that carries meaning on its own. From this insight the rest unfolds. The impressed token shapes become signs. To these are added pictographs, little drawings of the things being counted, a stylized head of grain for barley, an ox head for cattle, a fish for fish, a stylized vulva for woman, a foot for the verb to go. The earliest true tablets, from late Uruk, are covered in these little pictures and number signs, organized in boxes and rows, accounts, lists, records of the temple's wealth and the temple's transactions, the dry bookkeeping of the world's first bureaucracy. But pictures alone cannot capture language. You can draw an ox, but how do you draw yesterday, or if, or 30, or a person's name, or the word to love? Pictures can record things, but they cannot record speech. And language is speech. Language is sound. Language is grammar, and tense, and abstraction, and all the things that no drawing can show. And here the Sumerians made the second and even more brilliant leap. The leap that turned a system of accounting into true writing, capable of recording anything that could be said. They began to use signs for their sound rather than their meaning. This is the principle scholars call the rebus, and it is the engine of writing. Suppose the Sumerian word for read sounds like gi, and the word for to reimburse or to restore also sounds like gi. You cannot draw to reimburse, but you can draw a reed, and let the picture of the reed stand not for the reed, but for the sound gi, and so for the other, undrawable word that shares that sound. Once you do this, once a sign can stand for a sound rather than a thing, you can write anything. You can spell out words by their sounds. You can write names. You can write grammar. You can write abstractions, verbs, particles, the whole apparatus of language. The sign for an arrow, T, can be used to write the word life, also T, which no one could ever have drawn. Writing has escaped the trap of the picture and become a way of capturing speech. The Sumerian script that resulted was a mixed system. It always remained so, using some signs for their meaning and some for their sound, often combining the two, and using certain signs as silent determinatives that told the reader what category a word belonged to, a sign placed before the name of a god, or a city, or a wooden object, or a bird, to guide the reader. It was complex. It took years to learn. There were hundreds of signs, with multiple possible readings each. Mastering it was the work of a long education, and the people who mastered it, the scribes, were a small, prestigious, powerful elite, the keepers of the most powerful technology in the world. And the form of the writing changed too, shaped by the material it was written on. The earliest pictographs were scratched or drawn into the clay with a pointed tool, curving lines, recognizable little pictures. But drawing curves in clay is slow and messy. The stylus drags up little ridges of clay, and the lines come out ragged. The scribes found a faster, cleaner way. Instead of drawing lines, they pressed the end of a cut reed stylus into the clay, making a short wedge-shaped mark, a head and a tail, broad where the stylus first bit and tapering as it was lifted. By combining these wedges, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, in clusters, they could build up all the signs. It was faster, cleaner, and far better suited to the clay. but it meant that the signs gradually lost their pictorial quality. The little picture of an ox head, drawn in curving lines, became, over centuries, a cluster of abstract wedges that no longer looked like an ox at all. The writing became cuneiform, wedge writing, abstract, geometric, beautiful in its own austere way, utterly unlike the picture script it had grown from. By the time the script was mature, only a scholar could see, in the cluster of wedges, the ancient picture it descended from. Think for a moment about the material, the clay. It is easy to overlook, but the clay shaped everything. The Sumerians wrote on clay because clay was what they had, the one material the plain produced in endless abundance. They had no papyrus like Egypt, no good supply of the materials other cultures wrote on. They had mud, and so they wrote on mud, on small tablets of wet clay, formed in the hand, inscribed with the reed stylus while still soft, and then either left to dry in the sun, or, for the most important documents, baked hard in a fire. And here is one of the great accidents of history, one of the strokes of fortune that has shaped our entire knowledge of the ancient world. Clay is nearly indestructible. A sun-dried clay tablet is fragile, but a baked clay tablet is essentially eternal. It will not rot, will not burn, will not fade. It can be smashed, but the pieces survive, and even unbaked tablets are often accidentally baked and so preserved when the building they are stored in burns down. The libraries of Mesopotamia were preserved by the very fires that destroyed the cities that held them, while the papyrus records of Egypt and the parchment records of later ages have mostly crumbled to dust. The clay tablets of Sumer have come down to us by the hundreds of thousands, and there are, almost certainly, millions more still in the ground, in the unexcavated mounds, waiting. We have more written material from ancient Mesopotamia than from almost any other ancient civilization, precisely because they wrote on the most durable medium ever used for writing. The mud that made the plain so rich also made it the best recorded ancient civilization on Earth. The Sumerians, writing on clay because it was all they had, accidentally made their records immortal. What did they write? Once writing could record anything. Everything. That is the wonder of it. Once the technology existed, it spread into every corner of life. They wrote, still and always, the accounts, the great mass of cuneiform tablets, then and to the end, are economic and administrative documents, the records of the temple and palace economies, receipts and ration lists and inventories and contracts and account balances, the unglamorous lifeblood of a complex society. From these dry records we can reconstruct the Sumerian economy in extraordinary detail. What they grew and how much, what they traded and with whom, what a laborer was paid, what a field yielded, what a temple owned. They wrote the law, the contracts and the lawsuits and the legal codes, of which more later. They wrote letters, to gods, to kings, to family members, to business partners, and some of these are achingly human across the gulf of millennia. There survives a letter from a schoolboy at the Scribal Academy to his mother, complaining and asking for better clothes, and a famous letter from a young man, away from home, scolding his mother and reproaching her for not sending him fine garments the way other mothers do for their sons. Across 4,000 years, a teenager complains that his mother does not dress him as well as his friends' mothers dress them. The technology of writing reaches back and hands us, intact, the small immortal pettiness of family life. They wrote the lexical lists, long lists of words, organized by category, lists of all the kinds of trees, all the kinds of fish, all the professions, all the gods, all the cities, all the cuts of meat. These lists are, in a sense, the oldest scholarship in the world, the first attempts to organize knowledge, to make an inventory of the world, to teach the script by having students copy out the great catalogues of names. They are how the scribes were trained, and they are how the Sumerian language and writing were later preserved and studied by the Babylonians, who copied the old Sumerian lists for 2,000 years. They wrote the myths and the hymns and the prayers, the religious literature, the stories of the gods, the hymns of praise sung in the temples, the laments and the petitions, and they wrote the epics, the heroic tales of the great kings of old, above all the tales of Gilgamesh, which would be woven together into the first great work of literature in the history of the world. They even wrote, we should note, the first jokes and the first proverbs, collections of sayings, some wise, some funny, some bawdy, the folk wisdom of the plain set down in clay. Who has not supported a wife or child, runs one Sumerian proverb, has not borne a leash through his nose. There are riddles and fables of talking animals, and complaints and bits of satire, the full range of the human voice, from the sublime to the ridiculous, found its way, eventually, into the clay. And they wrote. This is perhaps the most poignant thing of all, for the future. They came to understand, these people who had invented the means of reaching across time, exactly what they had invented. The scribes were proud of their art. They boasted of their learning. They understood that what was written would outlast what was spoken, that a name set down in clay might be remembered when its bearer was long dead. Kings inscribed their deeds on clay cylinders and buried them in the foundations of their buildings, addressed explicitly to future rulers who might one day dig them up. And we, digging them up, are the future they wrote to, reading the messages they buried for whoever should come after. They knew what they were doing. They knew that writing was a form of immortality, and they were right. More right than they could have known, for they themselves were forgotten so utterly that their own immortality lay buried for 2,000 years before it was recovered. But it was recovered. The marks in the clay outlasted the hands that made them, outlasted the city, outlasted the language, outlasted the memory of the people, and finally, against everything, spoke again. That is what writing is. That is what they made. Marks that outlast the hand, a way for the dead to speak. Hold that thought as we go on. Everything else we will say about the Sumerians, their gods, their kings, their epic, their laws, their grief, we know because they wrote it down, in wedges, in clay, 5,000 years ago, and because the clay endured, and because, after the long forgetting, we learnt to read the wedges again. They wanted to be remembered. Tonight, lying in the dark, you are remembering them. It worked. Beneath the gods and the kings and the epics, beneath everything we admire and remember about the Sumerians, there lies a foundation so basic that it is easy to forget: the food. Every city, every temple, every work of art, every line of poetry rested on the grain that grew in the irrigated fields, and on the vast, patient, ingenious system by which that grain was grown, gathered, stored, and shared. To understand Sumer, you have to understand the field as well as the temple. And in Sumer, in truth, the field and the temple were not really separate things at all. Let us start with the land and the water, because everything begins there. We have spoken of the rivers, the violent, unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates, and of the great achievement of irrigation, the bringing of river water to the dry fields, but it is worth understanding more deeply what farming on the Mesopotamian plain actually involved, because it was utterly unlike farming anywhere else, and it produced both the great wealth of Sumer and, in the very long run, one of the seeds of its decline. The Sumerian farmer's year revolved around water and grain. The main crop was barley above all, far more than wheat, and for a reason that would prove fateful. The staple foods were barley bread and barley beer. The staple of the diet, and of the economy, and of the ration system, was the measure of barley. The Sumerians also grew wheat, and a great variety of vegetables and legumes: onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, beans, lentils, chickpeas, and, supremely, the date palm. The date palm deserves a moment of its own, because it was, after barley, the most important plant in Sumer, and it is one of the great symbols of the land. The date palm thrives in exactly the conditions the southern plain offered: intense heat, abundant water at the roots, salty soil it could tolerate when other crops could not. It gave an enormous yield of sweet, nourishing, storable fruit, the great sweetener and one of the great staples of the Mesopotamian diet. And it gave far more than fruit. Its wood for building, its fronds for roofing and weaving, its fiber for rope, every part of it used. The Sumerians understood the date palm intimately. They understood that the palms came in male and female, and that to get fruit you had to take the pollen from the male trees and apply it by hand to the flowers of the female trees, an early and sophisticated piece of deliberate agricultural intervention. The date orchards, with their tall palms casting shade over lower crops grown beneath them, were among the most productive growing systems in the ancient world. The farming year began in the autumn. Through the long, blazing summer, the land lay fallow and baked. The rivers were low, little grew. As the heat broke and autumn came, the farmer prepared the fields, and here the Sumerians used their inventions to the full. The fields were ploughed with the ox-drawn plough, which broke the earth far faster than any human digging, and they used a remarkable device, the cedar plough, a plough with a funnel attached, so that as the plough opened the furrow, seed dropped down the funnel directly into it, sowing and ploughing in a single operation, an elegant piece of agricultural engineering. We even have a Sumerian text, the Farmer's Almanac, the instructions of a father to his son on how to farm, which lays out the whole process in detail, season by season, task by task. How to prepare the field, how to manage the water, how to plough and sow and harvest and winnow, with the care and specificity of a working farmer who knew that everything depended on getting it right. It is one of the oldest agricultural manuals in the world, and it breathes the practical wisdom of the plain. Through the winter, the crops grew, watered by the irrigation canals. For the rain, as we have said, was nearly nothing, and everything depended on the controlled application of river water. The farmer flooded the fields from the canals, carefully, neither too little nor too much, and the canals themselves had to be kept clear and the banks maintained and the water shared with the neighbouring fields according to the agreed allotments. In the spring came the harvest, and the harvest was a race, because the spring was also when the rivers, swollen with mountain snowmelt, threatened to flood. The grain had to be cut and gathered and threshed before the floodwaters could come and ruin it. Harvest was a great communal labour, the whole community turning out, working against time, the most intense and most anxious season of the year. The grain was cut with sickles, at first sickles of baked clay, hard-fired and surprisingly effective, and later of bronze, gathered, threshed by driving animals or sledges over it, to break the grain from the husk, and winnowed by tossing it in the wind so the light chaff blew away and the heavy grain fell back. And then it was measured and stored, and the long accounting began. This brings us to the great institution at the centre of it all, the temple and the temple economy. In the Sumerian understanding, the land belonged to the god, the city was the god's, the fields were the god's, and the people were the god's tenants and servants, working the god's estate. The temple, the god's house, was therefore not only a place of worship, but the great landlord, the great employer, the great storehouse, and the great administrative centre of the city, all at once. It is hard for us to grasp how total this was, because we are used to separating religion from economics. In Sumer they were the same thing. To work the temple's fields was a religious act. To bring grain to the temple storehouse was an offering to the god. The whole productive life of the city was organized as service to the divine owner of the land. The temple owned vast estates, fields, orchards, herds, fisheries. Some of this land was worked directly by temple dependents, laborers, often supported entirely by rations from the temple stores. Some was allotted to temple personnel, priests, officials, craftsmen, to support themselves in exchange for their service. The temple employed, or supported, an enormous and varied workforce, not only priests and the religious staff, but ploughmen, shepherds, gardeners, fishermen, fowlers, weavers, spinners, fullers, potters, smiths, carpenters, leatherworkers, brewers, bakers, millers, porters, boatmen, scribes, overseers, and more. It ran great workshops, above all the textile workshops, which employed thousands of women and children spinning and weaving wool into cloth. For textiles were Sumer's great manufactured export, the goods that paid for the imported metal and stone and timber. The temple was, in effect, a giant integrated enterprise, farm, ranch, factory, bank, and government office, organized around the worship of a god and recorded in obsessive detail in writing. And the recording is how we know all this. The clay tablets of the temple archives are, overwhelmingly, economic documents, and from them we can reconstruct the system with a precision available for no other ancient economy. We can read the ration lists, allotting so many measures of barley per month to each worker according to status, a full ration for an adult man, less for a woman, less for a child, the whole workforce fed from the central stores. We can read the records of the harvest, field by field, the expected yield and the actual yield. We can read the inventories of the herds, the lists of the textile workers and their output, the accounts of the metal and the precious goods, the records of the trade expeditions. We can see a planned, administered, centrally recorded economy, 4,000 and 5,000 years old, laid out before us in the dry numerical poetry of the bookkeeper's clay. Alongside the temple, and growing in importance over the centuries, was the palace, the household of the king. As kingship developed, the king and the palace accumulated their own great estates and their own dependents and their own economic machinery, paralleling and sometimes rivaling the temple. There was tension, sometimes, between temple and palace, between the priesthood and the kingship, over land and wealth and authority, a tension that runs through Sumerian history, but the basic structure was the same, a great household, owning vast resources, supporting a large dependent population, organizing production and redistribution, recording everything in writing. And there was, importantly, also a private sector, though it is harder to see. because it generated fewer of the surviving records. Not all land belonged to the temple or the palace. There was private property, families owning their own fields, individuals buying and selling land and goods, lending at interest, going into debt, making contracts. People grew rich and grew poor. They borrowed and could not repay. Debt and the debt slavery that followed from it were a constant and growing problem, one that the kings periodically tried to address by proclaiming debt cancellations, wiping the slate clean, freeing the debt slaves, restoring the forfeited land acts of royal mercy and royal policy that are among the earliest attempts in history to manage the social damage of an economy that produced both great wealth and great inequality. Let us pause on what the Sumerians actually ate and drank, because it makes the abstraction concrete. The foundation was barley, as bread and as beer. Sumerian beer was not much like ours. It was thick, often drunk through a straw to filter out the floating husks and sediment, mildly alcoholic, nourishing, a food as much as a drink, consumed by everyone from laborers to gods. They had bread in many forms, porridge, dates and date syrup for sweetness, onions and garlic and the other vegetables, legumes, fish from the rivers and marshes and the Gulf, fresh and dried and salted, a hugely important protein source, the meat of sheep and goats and cattle and pigs. Though meat was more a luxury and a feature of feasts than an everyday food for most, milk and the products of milk, cheese and butter, oil, especially sesame oil, and honey, and fruits and a great variety of seasonings. The Sumerians, we know from their tablets, cared about food and about cooking. There survive actual recipes, the oldest written recipes in the world, detailed instructions for elaborate dishes, stews and broths rich with meat and fat and vegetables and herbs, clearly meant for the tables of the wealthy or the gods. They enjoyed their food. They wrote it down. Across 5,000 years, we can read what they liked to eat, but the brilliant, productive, intricately organized agricultural system of Sumer carried within it, from the beginning, a slow poison, and in the very long run it may have helped to undo them. It was the salt. When you irrigate land in a hot, dry climate, you bring water to the fields, and the water, when it evaporates in the fierce sun or when it sinks down and raises the water table, leaves behind its dissolved minerals, above all salt. Over generations, with constant irrigation and inadequate drainage, salt accumulates in the soil, and salt is poison to crops. The fields, century by century, grew saltier. We can actually read this happening in the records. Over the long span of Sumerian history, the proportion of wheat grown in the south declined, and the proportion of barley rose, because barley tolerates salt far better than wheat does, and the farmers, without perhaps fully understanding why, shifted to the crop that could still grow in the salting fields. And the yields, the records suggest, declined. The once fabulous productivity of the southern plain, slowly eroding as the salt crept up through the soil. The very system that made Sumer rich, irrigation in a dry, hot land, was, slowly, salting its own fields to death. It is one of the first examples in history of an environmental crisis caused by human success, a civilization undermined, over centuries, by the unintended consequences of its own most brilliant achievement. We will return to this when we come to the long decline. For now, hold it as a shadow at the edge of the bright picture, the salt, rising silently through the rich black soil, year after year, century after century, beneath the fields that fed the first civilization on earth. This was the foundation then, the field and the temple, the barley and the date palm, the canal and the storehouse, the ration list and the harvest race, the patient, ingenious, relentless labor of feeding the first cities, organized through the household of the god, recorded in the eternal clay. On this foundation everything else was built. The gods we will now meet, the kings, the epics, the laws, the science, all the glory of Sumer. It all grew, in the end, out of the grain in the irrigated fields and the system that gathered it in, and the god to whom the greatest of the fields belonged, and the gods who ruled the wind and the water and the moon and the morning star. It is time, now, to meet them. The Sumerians lived in a universe that was alive and full of will and frighteningly close. We tend, when we think of ancient religion, to think of it as something added on top of ordinary life, a set of beliefs, a set of rituals, a Sunday matter, a department. For the Sumerians it was nothing of the kind. The gods were not an addition to the world. The gods were the world. Every force the Sumerians depended on and feared, the rivers, the wind, the rain, the sun, the moon, the storm, The fertility of the fields and the flocks, the very ground beneath them and the sky above, was a god, a person, a will, who had to be served and fed and praised and placated, and who might, if neglected or angered, withdraw their favor and let the floods come, or the crops fail, or the city fall. The Sumerian did not look at the river and see water. They looked at the river and saw a god. They did not see weather. They saw the moods of divine persons. The whole of nature was a society of powerful, willful beings, and human life was the precarious business of keeping on the right side of them. And the gods were not abstractly distant. They lived in the cities, in their houses, the temples. The temple was, quite literally, the god's home. The cult statue inside was, in some real sense, the god present, the god's body, to be washed and clothed and fed and put to bed, attended day and night by the priesthood as a great lord is attended by his servants. The god ate. The offerings brought to the temple were the god's meals, set before the divine image, and afterward distributed to the temple staff and the king. The god slept, and woke, and held court, and went out in procession on festival days to visit other gods in other cities. The Sumerian gods were enormous, immortal, superhumanly powerful, but they were also, in their characters and their relationships and their quarrels and their appetites, startlingly human. They were like the people, only more so, more powerful, more passionate, more dangerous, less bound by rule, but recognizably persons, with families and rivalries and desires and tempers. There were a great many of them. The Sumerian pantheon was vast, hundreds of named deities, ranging from the great cosmic powers down to minor local spirits and the personal gods that watched over individuals and families. But at the top stood a relatively small number of supreme deities, the great gods who ruled the fundamental forces of the cosmos. And it is worth meeting them, because their characters and their stories run through everything else, and because they are the ancestors, directly, by long descent and transformation, of gods that would be worshipped across the Near East and the Mediterranean for thousands of years. First among them, in dignity if not always in active power, was An, the sky. An was the sky god, the most ancient and most exalted of the deities, the remote father of the gods, the source of authority and kingship. He dwelt in the highest heaven. His name was the word for sky itself, and he was, in a sense, the divine principle of authority and order. But An was distant, too high, too remote, too far above the affairs of earth to be much involved in them. Like many sky fathers in many mythologies, he tended to recede into the background, the source of all authority but rarely its active wielder. The great city of An was Uruk, which he shared with Inanna. Far more present, far more powerful in the actual running of the world, was Enlil. And Enlil is, for much of Sumerian history, the true king of the gods. Enlil was the god of wind and air and storm, the great atmospheric power, the force between the high heaven of An and the earth below. His name is often translated Lord Wind or Lord Air. He was the executive of the divine world, the one who actually carried out the decrees, who held the power to bless and to destroy, whose word, once spoken, could not be recalled. It was Enlil who held the tablet of destinies, the document that decreed the fates. It was Enlil whose blessing made a king legitimate. It was Enlil who, when humanity grew too numerous and too noisy and disturbed the rest of the gods, decreed the flood to wipe them out. Enlil could be benevolent, the giver of agriculture, of tools, of kingship. And he could be terrible, the bringer of the storm and the destroyer of cities. His great temple was the Ekur, the mountain house, at the city of Nippur, and Nippur held a unique place in Sumer. It was not a great political capital, it was the religious center, the holy city of all Sumer, the seat of Enlil, the place where the kings of the rival cities went to seek the blessing that legitimated their rule. To be acknowledged at Nippur, to be confirmed by Enlil, was what made a king truly king. Nippur was the spiritual heart of the Sumerian world, neutral ground, the city of the god whose favor all the others needed. Third of the great gods, and in many ways the most appealing, was Enki, later called Ea by the Babylonians. Enki was the god of fresh water, of the sweet underground waters, the springs and the marshes and the life-giving water that, in a dry land, meant everything, and from water he was, by extension, the god of wisdom, of cunning, of craft and technology and magic, of cleverness and creativity and problem-solving. Enki was the divine engineer, the patron of all the skills and arts that made civilization possible. He was the one who, in the myths, organized the world, assigned each thing its proper place and function, gave humanity the arts of life. He was clever and benevolent and a little tricky. The god who, again and again in the stories, helps humanity, who warns the flood hero to build his boat against the wrath of Enlil, who outwits the harsher gods, who solves the unsolvable problem. He was a friend to humankind in a pantheon that was often indifferent or hostile to it. His city was Eridu, the oldest city, the first city, the place where, the Sumerians believed, civilization itself had begun, and his temple there was one of the most ancient sacred sites in the world, the little shrine at the bottom of the great sequence we spoke of earlier. These three, An the sky, Enlil the wind, Enki the water, were the supreme male powers of the Sumerian universe. With them stood a great mother goddess, known by several names, Ninhursag, Lady of the Mountain, and others, the goddess of the earth, of birth, of the wild creatures, the mother of gods and of living things, who appears in the oldest myths as one of the great creative powers, sometimes shaping humanity from clay alongside Enki. And then there were the gods of the great lights of the sky, who ordered time and the heavens. Nanna, also called Sin, was the moon god, whose city was whose great ziggurat we climbed in our walk through the city, and who ruled the lunar calendar and the months. His son was Utu, called Shamash by the Babylonians, the sun god, the all-seeing eye that crossed the sky each day and saw everything that was done on earth, and who was therefore the god of justice, the divine judge, the one before whom wrongdoing could not be hidden, and to whom the wronged appealed. The sun that saw all became the god who judged all. A beautiful and natural connection, the light that reveals becoming the justice that holds to account. And above all, more vivid, more complex, more beloved and more feared than any of them, there was Inanna. Inanna, whom the Babylonians would call Istar, is one of the most extraordinary figures in the whole history of religion, and she deserves to be lingered over, because she is unlike anything in our own religious traditions, and yet, once you know her, unforgettable. She was the goddess of love, of sexual love, passionate and physical, the goddess of desire and fertility and the joining of bodies, and she was, at the very same time, the goddess of war, of battle, of strife, of the wild fury of combat. Love and war, the two great overwhelming passions, the two forces that most completely take possession of a human being and sweep away all reason. The Sumerians put both of them in the hands of a single goddess, and saw, rightly, that they were somehow akin, both ecstatic, both irresistible, both a kind of beautiful madness. She was the morning star and the evening star, the planet Venus, blazing in the dawn and the dusk. She was young and gorgeous and willful and proud and dangerous and utterly without the matronly dignity of a mother goddess. She was a force of nature in the form of a beautiful, headstrong, devastating young woman, and the Sumerians adored her and trembled at her. The greatest of the Inanna myths is her descent to the underworld, and it is one of the oldest and most powerful stories ever told. Inanna, in her pride and ambition, decides to descend into the great realm below the earth, the land of the dead, ruled by her terrible sister Ereshkigal. She passes through the 7 gates of the underworld, and at each gate she is forced to give up one of her garments and ornaments, her crown, her jewels, her robe, until at the last gate she stands naked, stripped of all her power, before her sister's throne. And there she is killed, struck dead, her corpse hung on a hook on the wall. The whole earth withers, for the goddess of love and fertility is dead in the land below. And it is Enki, clever benevolent Enki, who contrives her rescue, fashioning beings to go down and revive her. But the underworld does not give up its prey for nothing. The law of the dead is that no one who has entered may leave unless another takes their place. And so Inanna ascends, but a demon escort comes with her, to seize the substitute. And in the end the substitute chosen is her own husband, the shepherd king Dumuzi, who had not mourned her while she was dead, who sat at ease on his throne in his fine robes while she hung dead on the hook below. In her fury she gives him to the demons, and he is dragged down to the underworld in her place. Though his loving sister arranges that he shall spend only half the year below, and half the year above, so that he dies and rises with the seasons, descending when the land withers in the killing summer heat, returning when the world is reborn. This is the dying and rising god, the divine youth, the consort of the great goddess, who dies and is reborn with the cycle of the seasons, whose death the world mourns, and whose return the world celebrates. It is one of the deepest and most widespread patterns in the religions of the ancient Near East, and beyond Dumuzi and Inanna in Sumer, become Tammuz and Ishtar in Babylon, and the pattern echoes onward through Adonis and Aphrodite, through Attis and Cybele, through Persephone descending and rising, the eternal story of death and return, of the seed that must be buried before it can grow, of the grief of the world in winter and its joy in spring, given the shape of a divine love story and a divine death. The Sumerians told it first, or among the first, in the clay, 4,000 years ago and more. And bound up with Inanna and Dumuzi was one of the central rituals of Sumerian religion, the sacred marriage. Each year, in a great festival, the union of the goddess and her consort was reenacted, and the king himself, it seems, took the role of Dumuzi, the bridegroom, and a priestess took the role of Inanna, and their ritual union was meant to renew the fertility of the land, to ensure the return of the crops and the increase of the flocks and the prosperity of the city for another year. There survive Sumerian poems of the sacred marriage that are among the most beautiful and most frankly erotic love poetry in all of ancient literature. The goddess praising the beauty of her bridegroom, longing for him, inviting him to her bed, the language tender and sensual and joyful, the oldest love poetry in the world, sung in the temple as a sacrament on which the life of the land depended. How did human beings stand in relation to all these gods? Not well, in one sense, and here the Sumerian vision is darker than we might expect from a people who could write such joyful love poetry. The Sumerians believed that humanity had been created to serve the gods. Created, in fact, precisely to do the gods' work, so that the gods could rest. In the great creation myths, the lesser gods grew weary of the endless labor of digging the canals and tilling the fields and feeding themselves, and rebelled. And so the wise gods created humankind, fashioned from clay mixed with the blood or substance of a slain god, to take over the labor, to dig the canals, to grow the food, to build and serve the temples, to feed the gods with offerings, so that the gods need work no more. Humanity was, in this vision, the gods' workforce, made for service, existing to relieve the divine of toil. It is a humbler, harsher account of the human place in the cosmos than the ones we are used to. No image of God, no crown of creation, but a clay laborer made to dig the gods' ditches, and the afterlife the Sumerians imagined was bleak. The dead, all the dead, good and bad alike, king and slave alike, went down to the same grey underworld, the land of no return, a dim, dusty, joyless place beneath the earth, where the shades of the dead dwelt in darkness, eating dust and clay, clothed like birds in feathers, in eternal shadow. There was no heaven, no reward, no paradise for the virtuous. There was only the grey house of dust, for everyone, forever. The dead depended on the offerings of their living descendants, the food and drink brought to their graves, to ease their thirst and hunger in the dark below. A person with no descendants to make offerings was a wretched ghost indeed. This is why the Sumerians buried their dead beneath their houses and remembered them and fed them, not from sentiment alone, but because the dead needed it, because the grey underworld was a hard place, and the offerings of the living were the only comfort the dead could hope for. It is a sobering vision, and it makes the Sumerian love of life, their joy in beauty and beer and love and the bright crowded world, all the more poignant. They knew the gods had made them for labour. They knew the underworld waited, grey and dusty, for everyone. And in the face of that, they built their cities and painted their walls and sang their love songs and brewed their beer and told their stories and made, against the darkness below, a world as bright and beautiful and alive as they could make it. The most famous expression of this, the advice to seize the joy of life because the dark is coming for everyone, comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the greatest story they ever told, and it is to Gilgamesh, in time, that we will come. But first, between the gods and the epic, there stand the kings. The land of Sumer was never a single country. This is one of the most important things to understand about it, and one of the easiest to forget. We speak of Sumer and the Sumerians as if they were a nation, the way we speak of Egypt or Rome. But for most of their history, the Sumerians had no nation. They had cities, independent, rival, quarrelsome city-states, each with its own god and its own ruler and its own territory and its own fierce local pride, scattered across the southern plain, sometimes cooperating, often at war, never, for long, united under a single hand. A Sumerian was, first and foremost, a citizen of his city, a man of or of Lagash, or of Uruk, and only in a looser cultural sense a Sumerian at all. The cities shared a language, a writing system, a pantheon, a whole civilization, but they did not share a government, and they did not, on the whole, want to. Each city guarded its independence jealously. Each was devoted to its own god, who owned its land and protected its people, and was, in a sense, at rivalry with the gods of the other cities, as the cities were at rivalry with each other. The map of early Sumer was a patchwork of these little states, packed close together on the crowded plain, competing for the two things that mattered most: land and water above all. This is the dark side of the irrigation that made Sumer rich. The rivers and canals that fed the fields were finite. The cities upstream could take the water that the cities downstream needed. The boundaries between one city's fields and another's ran through contested territory, along contested canals. The most famous border war of early Sumer, one of the best documented conflicts in all of ancient history, recorded by the participants themselves in their inscriptions, was the long, bitter struggle between the cities of Lagash and Umma over a fertile borderland and the water that served it, a quarrel that dragged on across generations, flaring into war again and again, marked by treaties made and broken, boundary stones set up and torn down, oaths sworn and violated, a feud between two cities over a strip of land and a share of water that lasted longer than many empires. It is the first border dispute in recorded history, and it is wearily, depressingly familiar neighbours at each other's throats for generations over the line between their fields. Some things, it seems, are very old. Out of this competitive, dangerous, war-prone world, the institution of kingship was born, and its origins tell us a great deal. In the earliest times, the cities seem to have been governed less by kings than by their temples and their councils, by the priesthood that managed the god's estate, and perhaps by assemblies of the citizens or the elders. Sumerian tradition preserved a memory of these assemblies. In one famous epic, the king of Uruk consults two bodies, a council of elders and an assembly of the young fighting men, before going to war. One of the oldest glimpses we have of anything like deliberative, consultative government, a faint early echo of the idea that a ruler should take counsel, and that the community has a voice. We must not romanticize it. This was no democracy in any modern sense, but the memory of the assembly, of the council, of the king who consults rather than simply commands, is there in the oldest texts, and it is one of the threads that runs, faint and broken but real, from Sumer toward later ideas of consultative rule. But the assemblies and the temple councils were not enough for a world of constant war. War demands a leader, a single hand to command in the crisis, a war chief to lead the army when the men of Umma come for the border fields. And so, the evidence suggests, the institution of the king grew partly out of the needs of war, a leader chosen, perhaps at first temporarily, to command in the emergency, who then, as emergencies became chronic, as the wars never ended, made his temporary command permanent and hereditary, and turned the war leadership into a throne. The Sumerian word often translated king is lugal, literally big man, and there is something telling in that. The king began, perhaps, as the big man, the strong man, the war leader, the one who could protect the city and lead it to victory, and was rewarded with power for doing so. And kingship, once established, was wrapped in religious legitimacy, because in the Sumerian world nothing could stand without the gods. The Sumerian king list, a remarkable document, copied and recopied for centuries, that purports to list all the kings of Sumer from the very beginning, opens with a line that captures the whole theory. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship in this vision was not a human invention, but a divine gift, lowered from heaven to a particular city, granting that city primacy for a time, and then, when that city fell or failed, taken up again and given to another. The king list traces this divine kingship as it passes from city to city down the ages. Kingship in this city, then it was smitten with weapons, and kingship passed to that one, and then to another. A vision of history as the migration of a single divine office from city to city, each city ruling in its turn by the grace of the gods, none ruling forever. The king list is also famous for its first section, which lists the kings who reigned before the flood, and gives them reigns of staggering, impossible length, tens of thousands of years each, 8 kings reigning for hundreds of thousands of years between them before the waters came. These antediluvian reigns are clearly legendary, mythological, not history in any literal sense, but they are fascinating, because they show the Sumerians' own sense of their immense antiquity, their belief that their civilization reached back, through the flood, into a time of godlike kings and almost unimaginable depth. And they have an echo, again, in the Bible, in the impossibly long lifespans of the patriarchs before Noah's flood, Methuselah and the rest. The pattern of godlike figures with enormous lifespans in the age before the flood is a Mesopotamian inheritance. The king's duties, as the Sumerians understood them, were several, and they were heavy. He was the war leader, the protector of the city, the commander of its armies. He was the great builder, and Sumerian royal inscriptions are obsessed with building, for to build and restore the temples of the gods, to dig and maintain the canals, to raise the walls, was among the highest of royal duties, the visible proof of a good and pious reign. He was the chief priest, or close to it the intermediary between the city and its god, the one who performed the great rituals, who took the role of the bridegroom in the sacred marriage, on whose piety the favor of the gods depended. He was the source of justice, the one responsible for right order in the land, for the protection of the weak against the strong, for the maintenance of the laws, and he was, increasingly, the great landowner and economic power, the master of the palace and its estates, rivaling and sometimes overshadowing the temple. The ideal of the just king is one of the most striking and most important Sumerian legacies, and it appears very early. The kings boast, in their inscriptions, not only of their conquests and their buildings but of their justice, and specifically of their protection of the vulnerable. One of the earliest of all is the reformer Uruk or Uru Inimgina of Lagash, who, around 2400 years before our era, proclaimed a set of reforms to relieve the people from the oppressions and exactions of officials and the powerful, and whose inscriptions contain what may be the first recorded use of the word freedom, Amagi, literally return to the mother, referring to the freeing of debt slaves in human history. The first written appearance of the idea of freedom is in a Sumerian reform proclamation, 24 centuries before our era, in the context of releasing the poor from debt bondage. The kings claimed to make justice appear, to protect the orphan and the widow from the powerful, to ensure that the weak were not the prey of the strong. How well they lived up to it is another question. These are royal boasts, propaganda, and the reality was surely far harsher. But the ideal itself, the idea that the legitimacy of a ruler rests, in part, on his protection of the weak and his maintenance of justice, is a Sumerian idea, set down in clay, 4,000 years and more ago, and it has never since left us. The wars between the cities, the endless competition for land and water and primacy, eventually produced attempts at hegemony, at one city dominating the others, at the gathering of the divine kingship into a single hand. Various cities rose to brief preeminence. Kish, in the north of Sumer, so much so that King of Kish became a title claimed by any ruler with pretensions to wider dominion. Uruk, Lagash, mighty kings arose who conquered their neighbors and proclaimed themselves overlords of all the land. But these hegemonies were fragile and brief. The cities would not stay conquered, the divine kingship would not stay in one place, and again the unity dissolved back into the patchwork of quarreling states. The Sumerians, it seems, could conceive of one city dominating the others for a time, but they could not, or would not, build a stable, lasting, unified state. That achievement would come, when it came, from outside the Sumerian heartland, from a Semitic-speaking conqueror from the north named Sargon, who would do what no Sumerian had managed and weld the whole land, and far more, into the first true empire in history. But that is a later part of the story. There is one more thing to say about the Sumerian kings, and it is the thing that connects them to the greatest of all their stories. The kings of Sumer were mortal. This was the iron law, the thing that separated them from the gods. They might be great, mighty, semi-divine in their function, builders and warriors and bringers of justice. Some later kings would even be deified, worshipped as gods in their own lifetimes or after death. But death came for them as it came for everyone, and they knew it, and the knowledge of it haunts their literature. The king, for all his power, must go down at last to the grey house of dust like the meanest of his subjects. All his building and conquest and glory could not buy him one extra day. The underworld waited for the Lugal as for the labourer, and out of that knowledge, out of the confrontation between the greatest of kings and the fact of his own death, the Sumerians, and the Babylonians after them, made the first great work of literature in the history of the world, a story about a king who was the strongest and most magnificent of all men, who was part god and built mighty walls and performed great deeds, and who could not, in the end, escape death, and who had to learn, through grief and a long, hopeless journey, to accept it and to find what meaning he could in the brief, bright life that was all any human being would ever be given. The king was Gilgamesh, and his story is the one we have been moving toward all along. There is a story that is older than the Bible, older than Homer, older than almost any story that human beings still tell. It is the oldest long story we have, the first great work of literature in the history of the world, and it is about the thing every human being must one day face, and which no one has ever escaped. It is about death, and the fear of death, and the long futile search to escape it, and the hard wisdom of learning, at last, to live anyway. It is the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was, it seems, a real king, a king of Uruk, who reigned in the dim early centuries of Sumerian history, around 2700 years before our era or thereabouts, in the deep past even by the standards of the people who first told his story. He appears in the king list among the early rulers of Uruk, and whatever the real man was, he became, in the centuries after his death, the greatest hero of Sumerian legend, the subject of a cycle of Sumerian poems telling of his deeds, which the later Babylonians wove together and reshaped, over many centuries, into a single great epic in the Akkadian language, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the version we know best, found among the broken tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, and slowly reassembled by scholars across the last century and a half. It is, in a sense, the first novel, the first sustained imaginative exploration of a human life and a human problem, and it remains, after 4,000 years, one of the most moving things human beings have ever written. Let us tell it. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was 2 parts god and 1 part man, the son of a goddess and a mortal king, the most magnificent of all men, the strongest, the most beautiful, the most energetic. He built the great walls of Uruk, that mighty circuit of brick that the epic invites us to climb and admire, but his very greatness was a torment to his city, for his energy had no equal to spend itself against, and so it turned to oppression. He wore out the young men in contests and labor. He took the women as he pleased. He gave the people of Uruk no peace, and the people cried out to the gods, "He is too much for us, this king. He is more than a man should be. Send him an equal, someone to match him, so that Uruk may have rest." And the gods heard, and the mother goddess took clay and made an equal for Gilgamesh, a wild man, Enkidu, born in the wilderness, covered in hair, running with the gazelles, eating grass with the beasts, knowing nothing of cities or men or any human thing. Enkidu was Gilgamesh's match in strength, and his opposite in everything else. Wild where Gilgamesh was civilized, innocent where Gilgamesh was knowing, a creature of the open wilderness against the king of the walled city. Then the story of how Enkidu is drawn out of the wilderness and made human is one of the strange, profound passages of the epic. He is civilized through the love of a woman, a temple courtesan sent to him, whose embraces tame him, after which the wild beasts flee from him and will no longer accept him as one of their own. For in becoming human, in coming to know love and the works of humanity, he has lost the wilderness forever. It is a parable, very ancient and very deep, about what it costs to become civilized, about the gain of human love and human knowledge, and the loss of the wild innocence that can never be recovered. Enkidu comes to Uruk, and he and Gilgamesh meet, and they fight, a tremendous wrestling match, the 2 greatest beings in the world, shaking the walls, and neither can defeat the other. They are perfectly matched, and when the fight is over, exhausted, they embrace, and from that moment they are not rivals but the dearest of friends, bound by a love that is the emotional heart of the whole epic. This, the friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the love between the king and the wild man, the most intense bond in the story, is one of the first and greatest depictions of friendship in literature, and everything that follows turns on it. Together, the 2 friends go in search of glory and great deeds. They journey to the distant cedar forest, far to the west or north, the great forest of timber that the timberless plain so craved, to confront and slay its terrible divine guardian, the monster Humbaba, and to cut its sacred cedars. It is a tale of adventure, of fear and courage, of 2 friends encouraging each other through terror toward a deed that will make their names immortal. For Gilgamesh, even now, is driven by the longing for a name that will outlast him, the hero's bargain, the attempt to defeat death by doing deeds so great that they will be remembered forever. They kill Humbaba against the will of the gods, and take the cedars, and return in triumph. And then Gilgamesh, in his glory, is desired by the goddess Inanna herself, Ishtar, who offers herself to him as a bride. And Gilgamesh refuses her, refuses the goddess of love, and not gently. He insults her, recounting the fates of her former lovers, all the men and gods and creatures she had loved, and then destroyed or transformed in her fickleness and cruelty. It is a reckless thing to scorn the goddess of love and war to her face. And Inanna, enraged, humiliated, goes up to heaven and demands of her father, the sky god, that he send down the bull of heaven to destroy Gilgamesh and his city. The bull of heaven comes down, a monster of drought and devastation, whose snorting opens pits that swallow hundreds of men, and the two friends, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, fight it together and kill it. And Enkidu, in his triumph and his defiance, tears off a haunch of the dead bull and hurls it in the goddess's face. And that is the hinge of the whole story. For the gods, in council, decree that this is too much, that the killing of Humbaba and now the killing of the bull of heaven, these defiances of the divine, must be paid for, and that one of the two friends must die, and the one they choose is Enkidu. Enkidu falls sick, a long, slow, wasting sickness, decreed by the gods, and dies. And Gilgamesh, who has never known loss, who has never been defeated, who in all his godlike strength has never met anything he could not overcome, Gilgamesh watches his friend, the other half of his soul, sicken and waste and die, and can do nothing. He sits by the body. He will not let it be buried. He mourns with a grief that is one of the most powerful evocations of grief in all of literature, raging, disbelieving, refusing to accept it, until, the epic says, a worm fell out of his dead friend's nose, and Gilgamesh at last understood that Enkidu was truly gone, that the body was only a body, that death was real and final, and had taken the person he loved most in the world. And then comes the great turn, the turn that makes Gilgamesh not just an adventure tale, but the first profound meditation on the human condition. For in his grief for Enkidu, Gilgamesh confronts, for the first time, his own death. If Enkidu, strong, beloved, irreplaceable Enkidu, could die, then so can Gilgamesh, so will Gilgamesh. The king who was two parts god, the strongest and greatest of all men, must die, like his friend, like everyone, and go down to the grey house of dust. And this knowledge, the knowledge of his own mortality, suddenly real, suddenly unbearable, drives Gilgamesh half mad with terror, and sends him on the great quest that occupies the rest of the epic, the quest to escape death, to find the secret of eternal life, to not die. He sets out, alone now, in mourning rags, his beauty wasted, wandering the wilderness, driven by a single desperate question: is there a way not to die? He has heard of one man who escaped death, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood, the one man and his wife to whom the gods, after the waters, granted eternal life. And Gilgamesh resolves to find him at the ends of the earth and learn from him the secret. The journey is long and terrible. He crosses the mountain where the sun rises and sets, passing through a tunnel of utter darkness. He comes to a tavern at the edge of the world, kept by a wise woman, and she, in lines that are among the most famous and most beautiful in all ancient literature, though they survive most fully in an older version of the text, tells him the hard truth, that his quest is hopeless, that the gods kept eternal life for themselves and gave death to humankind, and that since he cannot escape death, he should turn back and live, should fill his belly with good things, should feast and make merry, should wear clean clothes and bathe, should cherish the child who holds his hand and the wife who delights in his embrace. For this, the simple goodness of the brief mortal life, is the lot the gods have given to humankind, and the only thing a human being truly has. It is the oldest version of a piece of wisdom that humanity has had to relearn in every age, that since we must die, we should live, that the brevity of life is the very thing that makes its ordinary joys precious. Seize the day, cherish the people you love. The dark is coming, so light the lamp now. But Gilgamesh will not turn back. He crosses the waters of death, and he comes at last to Utnapishtim, the immortal flood survivor, and Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. This is the passage George Smith read in the British Museum and leapt up in astonishment. How the gods, troubled by the noise and multitude of humankind, decreed to destroy them with a flood. How the clever god Enki, in defiance of the others, warned Utnapishtim and told him to build a great boat and load aboard his family and the seed of all living things. How the flood came and covered the earth and destroyed all of humanity, save those in the boat. How the boat came to rest on a mountain. How Utnapishtim sent out birds, a dove, a swallow, a raven, to find dry land. How, when the waters receded, he made sacrifice, and the gods, who had themselves nearly starved without humanity to feed them with offerings, gathered hungrily around it, and regretted what they had done, and granted Utnapishtim and his wife eternal life. It is the original of Noah, 1,000 years and more before Genesis, in nearly every detail, the divine decision to destroy, the chosen survivor, the great boat, the animals, the mountain, the birds sent out, the sacrifice after. The flood story flowed from Sumer through Babylon into the Bible and down to us. And then Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the thing he came so far to hear, and it is the cruelest answer of all. There is no secret. Utnapishtim's immortality was a one-time gift of the gods, in a unique circumstance that will never come again. There is no method, no way, no technique that Gilgamesh can learn. Death cannot be escaped. To prove how far Gilgamesh is from conquering death, Utnapishtim challenges him merely to conquer sleep, to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and Gilgamesh, exhausted from his journey, fails almost at once, falling asleep where he sits, sleeping for days, unable even to defeat sleep, death's little brother, let alone death itself. There is one last hope. Utnapishtim, taking pity, tells Gilgamesh of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant of rejuvenation, that will not make him immortal, but will restore lost youth. And Gilgamesh dives, weighting himself with stones, down into the deep, and finds the plant, and seizes it, and rises with it, overjoyed, for he will at least bring it back to Uruk, and grow young again, and share it with the old men of his city. But on the long road home, stopping to bathe in a pool of cool water, he sets the plant down on the bank, and a snake, drawn by its fragrance, slides up out of the water and eats it, and sloughs off its skin as it goes, renewed, young again. Which is why, the story says, snakes shed their skins and seem to be reborn, while human beings cannot. And the plant is gone. The last hope is gone. Gilgamesh sits down on the bank and weeps, and then he goes home, empty-handed, having failed in everything he set out to do. He did not become immortal. He did not even keep the plant of youth. His great quest ended in total defeat. He comes back to Uruk with nothing. Nothing except, perhaps, the one thing that was the whole point all along. The wisdom to accept his mortality, and to find his meaning not in escaping death, but in what he can build and leave behind within the span of a mortal life. For the epic ends as it began, with the walls of Uruk. Gilgamesh, returned, shows the walls to the boatman who brought him home. He invites him, as the epic invited us at the start, to climb the wall and walk along its top, and inspect its mighty brickwork, and admire it. The walls are what Gilgamesh has made, the lasting work of his hands, the achievement that will outlive him, the thing that is left when the man is gone. He could not defeat death. No one can. But he built something that endured, the city, the walls, the works of his reign, and in that, and in the story that would be told of him, he found the only immortality a human being can have. Not the body that goes down to the dust, but the made thing and the remembered name that remain behind. This is the oldest long story we have. And look how modern it is. How nothing essential has changed. A man of enormous gifts, who has everything, comes face to face with the death of someone he loves, and is shattered by it, and is driven by terror of his own death into a desperate search for some escape, and finds that there is no escape, that death is the one fact that cannot be argued with or bought off or outrun, and that the only thing to do is to live, fully and gratefully, in the brief light that is all we get, and to make and build and love so that something of us remains when we are gone. The Sumerians and the Babylonians who completed their story understood this 4,000 years ago. They wrote it down in the clay, and every human being who has ever lost someone they loved, who has ever lain awake afraid of their own dying, who has ever had to learn the hard art of living anyway, every one of them is in this story, the oldest story, the story of the king who wanted to live forever and learnt, instead, how to live. The dark is coming, the wise woman told him at the edge of the world. So fill your belly with good things. Cherish the child who holds your hand. Bathe and put on clean clothes. Let the one who loves you delight in your embrace. It is good advice. It was good advice 4,000 years ago. It is good advice tonight. In the years after the First World War, the English archaeologist Leonard Woolley came to the mound of in the south of Iraq, and began one of the most famous excavations in the history of archaeology. Over 12 seasons, through the 1920s and into the 30s, Woolley uncovered the great city of its ziggurat, its temples, its houses, the neighborhood we walked through earlier. But the discovery that made famous around the world, and that remains one of the most spectacular and most haunting finds ever made, was the royal cemetery and the dark secret it held. Beneath the city, in a great pit that the Sumerians had used as a burial ground over centuries, Woolley found thousands of graves. Most were ordinary, simple burials, the body wrapped or in a coffin, with a few possessions, a pot, a tool, a personal ornament, the modest equipment a Sumerian thought necessary for the grey journey to the underworld. But among the ordinary graves, Woolley found 16 that were entirely different. Graves so rich, so elaborate, so astonishing in their contents, and so terrible in their implications, that he called them the royal tombs. The royal tombs were not simple pits. They were built tombs, stone and brick chambers, sometimes vaulted, at the bottom of deep shafts, approached by ramps, and they were filled with treasure of a magnificence that no one had imagined could come out of the Sumerian world. Gold vessels of gold, weapons of gold, ornaments of gold, in abundance. The famous gold helmet of a king, beaten from a single sheet of gold into the form of a wig, the locks of hair and the ears rendered in exquisite detail, one of the supreme masterpieces of ancient goldsmithing. Daggers with golden blades and hilts of lapis lazuli studded with gold, vessels of gold and silver and electrum, and jewellery, extraordinary jewellery, of gold and silver and lapis lazuli and carnelian, in profusion. The greatest of the tombs belonged to a woman whose name we know, because it was inscribed on a seal found with her, Puabi. She was a great lady, a queen, or a high priestess, or both. Her exact status is debated, and she was buried in a splendour that takes the breath away. Her body lay on a bier, and upon it, and around it, was an overwhelming wealth of ornament. She wore an elaborate headdress of gold, great gold ring earrings, a wreath of gold leaves and rings, a comb of gold topped with gold flowers, layered over a wig, the whole confection of gold and lapis and carnelian framing her head in a cascade of precious metal and stone. She wore a beaded cape of gold and lapis and carnelian and agate covering her upper body, and chokers and necklaces and rings, and a garter of beads. Beside her were her personal possessions, including, famously, a set of cosmetic items and a gold drinking tube, and the seal that gave her name. She went to the grey underworld, dressed as a queen of heaven, weighted with the wealth of an empire, and around her, and around the kings in the other great tombs, lay the bodies of other people. This is the dark secret of the royal tombs, and it is one of the most chilling discoveries in all of archaeology. In the great death pits attached to the royal burials, Woolley found not one body, but many. In some pits, dozens. In the largest, what he called the Great Death Pit, 74 bodies, mostly women, lay in neat rows on the floor of the pit, dressed in their finery, with the soldiers and guards and grooms and the drivers of the wagons, and the oxen that drew the wagons, and the musicians with their instruments. An entire retinue, the court of the dead ruler, laid down in death around their lord or lady, to accompany them into the underworld. These people had been buried alive, or rather, they had gone down into the pit alive, with the dead ruler, and died there. Woolley reconstructed the scene with a kind of awed horror, and though some of the details of his reconstruction have been questioned and revised by later scholars, the essential fact is not in doubt. The members of the court, the ladies in waiting in their golden headdresses, the soldiers with their weapons, the grooms with the oxen, the musicians with their lyres and harps, descended into the great pit, in their finest dress, in a solemn procession, to the music of those very lyres. They arranged themselves in their places, and then, Woolley believed they drank a drug or a poison, lay down in their rows, and died. Later analysis has suggested some may have met a more violent end, struck down where they lay, and then they were dead, all of them, the whole court, and the pit was filled in over them, and the music stopped, and the ruler went down to the underworld with a full retinue to serve them in the dark below. It is hard to take in. These were not slaves dragged unwilling to the slaughter. The evidence suggests they were the elite, the court, dressed in gold, and they seem to have gone willingly, or at least in accordance with a custom so powerful that resistance was unthinkable. The belief, presumably, that to die with one's lord and accompany them into the afterlife was a duty, or an honour, or simply the natural and inescapable order of things. The musicians played their lyres as they descended. One harpist, Woolley found, had died with her hands still at her instrument, the bones of her fingers lying among the remains of the strings. They went down to the music, in their finest clothes, and lay down, and died, so that a queen would not go alone into the grey house of dust. This practice of human sacrifice at royal burials, retainer sacrifice, the killing of a ruler's court to accompany them in death, appears only in this brief early period at Ur, and then vanishes from Mesopotamian practice. It was not a constant feature of Sumerian life, but a phenomenon of a particular time and place, and it remains, in many ways mysterious, but it tells us something profound and sobering about the Sumerian world, about the absolute power that a ruler might command, about the totality of the belief in the afterlife and its needs, about a vision of the cosmos in which the death of a king was so great a rupture that an entire court must follow them through it. It is a reminder, too, against any temptation to romanticize the ancient world. This was a society capable of magnificent art and profound poetry and the invention of civilization itself, and it was also a society in which dozens of people might be put to death to furnish a royal funeral. Both things are true. The gold and the death pit are in the same tomb. But let us not end on the horror, for the royal tombs gave us also some of the most beautiful objects ever recovered from the ancient world, and they deserve to be seen. There is the standard of a small box, inlaid on two faces with mosaic scenes of shell and lapis lazuli and red limestone, set into bitumen. One face shows war, the Sumerian army, the soldiers in their cloaks, the chariots, solid-wheeled battle cars drawn by onagers, driving over the bodies of the enemy, prisoners led naked before the king. The other face shows peace, a great feast, the king and the nobles seated, drinking, served by attendants, while below, a procession brings the produce of the land, animals, fish, sacks of goods, and a musician plays a lyre and a singer sings. War and peace, the two faces of the king's power and the city's life, rendered in tiny precise mosaic 4,500 years ago, every figure full of life and character. We do not know what the object actually was. Woolley guessed it was a standard carried on a pole, hence the name, but it may have been the sounding box of a musical instrument, or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it is one of the great pictorial documents of the Sumerian world, a window onto their war and their feasting. There are the lyres, the actual musical instruments, found in the death pits beside the bones of the musicians who played them. The wood had perished, but Woolley recovered their form and their ornament, and reconstructed them. Beautiful instruments, their sounding boxes adorned with the head of a bull worked in gold and lapis lazuli, the bull's beard of deep blue lapis, the eyes inlaid. The great lyre, with its golden bull's head, is among the most famous objects from and below the bull's head, on the front of the sounding box, a mosaic panel shows scenes of fantasy and myth, animals walking upright like men, a feast served by beasts, a scorpion man, scenes whose meaning we can only guess but which seem to come from some Sumerian story or vision of the world turned wonderfully upside down. These are the very lyres whose music played as the court descended into death. We can reconstruct the instruments. We cannot reconstruct the music. The melodies that played in the death pit are gone, like all Sumerian music, into the silence. There is the ram in a thicket, Woolley's romantic name, borrowed from the biblical story, for a pair of statuettes showing a goat or ram rearing up against a flowering tree or thicket, made of gold and silver and lapis lazuli and shell. The creature's fleece rendered in shell and lapis, its face and legs in gold, standing on its hind legs to reach the branches. It is a strange and lovely object, full of life and movement, the goat caught in the act of reaching upward, and it carries some religious meaning we can only partly read. The goat and the sacred tree are images that recur in Mesopotamian art, bound up with fertility and the divine. And there is the gaming board, the royal game of a beautiful inlaid board for a game played with dice or knucklebones and counters, found in the tombs, the rules of which were partly recovered, much later, from a cuneiform tablet that described how to play. The first civilization on Earth played board games, for fun, in the evenings, for pleasure and competition, and the simple human delight of a game. And they took the game with them into the tomb, to play, presumably, in the long dark afterlife. There is something deeply touching in that, among the gold and the daggers and the terrible death pit. A game, a thing made purely for play, for the enjoyment of an idle hour, carried down into death so that the dead would have something to play in the underworld. The royal tombs of then, hold the whole Sumerian world in concentrated form. The magnificent artistry, the gold and the lapis, the bull-headed lyres, the mosaic standard, the reaching golden goat, the proof of a civilization that loved beauty and could make it on the highest level, the wealth and the power, the empire's gold heaped on a single queen, the board game, the small human pleasures, and the darkness, the death pit, the rows of dressed bodies, the harpist dead with her hands on the strings, the absolute and terrible logic of a world in which a court might be required to die with its king, all of it together, in the same ground, 4,500 years old, dug up out of the silt by Woolley and his workers and carried into the light, where it sits now in the museums of London and Philadelphia and Baghdad, gleaming and silent, offering and withholding, telling us so much and leaving so much untold. They went down to the music in their golden headdresses and lay down in their rows, and the pit was filled in over them. The gold endured, the music did not. We have the lyre, we have lost the song. The land of Sumer was rich in two things, and poor in almost everything else. It had grain, the produce of the irrigated fields, the great surplus that fed the cities, and it had mud, and reeds, and water. But of the materials that a civilization needs to build and adorn and arm itself, it had almost nothing. No stone, not even ordinary building stone, let alone the fine hard stones for carving. No metal, no copper, no tin, no gold, no silver in the ground of the plain. No timber worth the name, the date palm and the poplar and the reeds of the marsh, but no great trees, no cedar, no hardwood for building or for ships, no precious or semi-precious stones. The richest agricultural land in the ancient world was, in every other respect, one of the most resource-poor. And so the Sumerians traded. They had to. Everything that was not grain or mud or reed had to be brought in from outside, and to pay for it, they sent out their surplus, grain, and above all the manufactured goods of their workshops, especially the woolen textiles woven by the thousands of workers in the temple and palace workshops. Sumer exported cloth and grain, and imported the whole material basis of its civilization. The first great civilization was also, of necessity, one of the first great trading societies, reaching out across the ancient world in search of the things its rich poor land could not provide. The trade ran in several directions, overland, to the east and north, into the highlands of Iran and the mountains beyond, for copper, for tin, for stone, for the deep blue lapis lazuli that the Sumerians prized above almost any other material and that came, astonishingly, from a single region of mines in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers away, passing from hand to hand and region to region along a chain of trade that carried it, at last, to the workshops of Sumer, where it was carved into beads and inlay, and the blue beards of the bull-headed liars. The presence of Afghan lapis in the tombs of Ur is one of the most striking proofs of the immense reach of these ancient trade networks. A blue stone from the roof of the world, mined in the mountains of Central Asia, ending up on the headdress of a Sumerian queen, having travelled a distance that staggers the imagination, at a time when every step of the journey was made on foot, or by pack animal, or by boat, and the trade ran by sea, down the rivers to the head of the Persian Gulf, and out along the Gulf to the south and east. The Sumerians were seafarers as well as river boatmen. Their boats sailed the Gulf, trading with the lands along its shores, and the records and the myths preserve the names of three great trading partners to the south and east, three lands of legend and commerce whose names ring through the Sumerian texts: Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha. Dilmun was the nearest, the island and coastal region we identify with modern Bahrain and the adjacent Arabian shore. Dilmun was a great trading entrepot, the crucial middleman of the Gulf trade, the place where the goods of the lands further east and south were gathered and exchanged. Through Dilmun passed the copper and the other goods of the lands beyond. Dilmun grew rich on the trade, a prosperous commercial centre where the merchants of Sumer met the goods of the wider world. And Dilmun was more than a trading post in the Sumerian imagination. It was a sacred land, a paradise, a place of purity and life. In one of the most beautiful Sumerian myths, Dilmun is described as a pure, clean, bright land where there is no sickness and no death, where the lion does not kill and the wolf does not snatch the lamb, where the old woman does not say, "I am an old woman," and the old man does not say, "I am an old man," a land of primordial innocence and immortality, a Sumerian Eden at the edge of the world, beyond the trade routes, where the waters of life flowed and death had no dominion. The trading island became, in myth, the blessed land, the paradise. And there is, perhaps, an echo here too of the biblical Eden, that other garden of innocence and life at the beginning of things. Magan was further out, the land we identify with modern Oman, and perhaps the facing coast, on the far side of the Gulf's mouth. And Magan was, above all, the land of copper. The mountains of Oman held rich deposits of copper ore, and Magan was the great copper source for the Sumerian world, the place from which came the metal that, alloyed with tin, made the bronze of the Bronze Age, the bronze of the tools and the weapons and the vessels. Sumerian texts speak of the copper of Magan, of ships of Magan, of expeditions to Magan. The copper trade of the Gulf was one of the great arteries of the ancient economy, and Magan was its source. Magan was also a source of diorite and other hard stones, the very stone, perhaps, from which the famous statues of Gudea of Lagash were carved, that dark, dense, beautiful stone that the plain itself could not provide. And furthest of all, at the very edge of the Sumerian world, lay Meluha. And Meluha is one of the great tantalizing names of ancient geography. For Meluha is almost certainly the civilization of the Indus Valley, the great urban civilization that flourished, contemporary with Sumer, in the valley of the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with their astonishing planned streets and their drainage systems, and their own undeciphered script. The third of the great early civilizations alongside Sumer and Egypt. Meluha was the source, the Sumerians said, of exotic and precious things, of carnelian, the red-orange stone they prized and carved into beads, and Indus carnelian beads, etched with white patterns by a distinctive Indus technique, have been found in Mesopotamia, hard physical proof of the contact, of ivory, of certain woods and animals and luxuries, of the things that came from the strange rich land at the far end of the sea. There were even, the records suggest, Melahan merchants resident in Mesopotamia, a community of Indus traders living in a Sumerian city, with their own interpreter, the first recorded instance of a foreign merchant community, an Indus Valley diaspora in Bronze Age Sumer, 4,000 years ago. The two great civilizations of the east and the west of the ancient world, Sumer and the Indus, were in contact, trading across the Gulf and the Arabian Sea, exchanging goods and, surely, ideas and people, in one of the oldest long-distance international relationships in human history. Think of what this means. 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, a network of trade and exchange reached from the mountains of Afghanistan, where the lapis was mined, across to the cities of the Indus, down the Gulf through Dilmun and Magan, up the rivers into the heart of Sumer, and onward, by other routes, toward Egypt and Anatolia and the Mediterranean world. Goods passed along these routes that travelled distances no single person ever travelled. Lapis from Central Asia, carnelian from India, copper from Oman, tin from sources still partly mysterious, timber from the mountains, all converging on the cities of the plain and the textiles and grain of the plain flowing outward in return. The first civilization was, from the beginning, a connected civilization, plugged into a web of exchange that spanned a good part of the known world, dependent on that web for the very materials of its life, enriched and shaped by its contact with distant lands. Globalization, in a real sense, is very old. The first cities were trading cities, reaching out across deserts and seas for the things they lacked, and the world they reached out to was larger and more connected than we often imagine. And with the goods came ideas. Trade is never only the exchange of things. It is the exchange of techniques, of fashions, of stories, of ways of doing and seeing. The contact between Sumer and Egypt in the early period, debated in its details but real, may have carried the very idea of writing, or the stimulus to invent it, from one to the other, though each developed its own distinct script. The contact between Sumer and the Indus carried goods and merchants, and surely much else that we cannot trace. The whole ancient Near East and beyond was bound together, loosely but really, by these threads of exchange, and the first civilization sat at the center of the web, pulling in the materials of the world and sending out the products of its workshops, connected, cosmopolitan, dependent, and enriched. The poverty of the plain, in everything but grain and mud, was, in the end, one of the engines of its civilization. Because they had to trade, the Sumerians had to reach out, had to build the boats and the routes and the relationships, had to develop the accounting and the credit and the contracts that long-distance trade requires. A land that had everything might have turned inward. The land that had only grain and mud was forced, by its own poverty, to engage with the whole world, and that engagement was part of what made it the brilliant, connected, outward-looking civilization that it was. Lapis from Afghanistan on a dead queen's brow, carnelian from India in a merchant's pouch, copper from Oman in a soldier's blade, cedar from the western mountains in a temple's roof. The first civilization was woven of threads that reached to the ends of the known earth. And tonight, when we trace those threads, we are tracing the first faint outline of the connected world we still live in. We have spent much of this night among the great things, the cities and the gods, the kings and the epics, the gold of the royal tombs and the reach of the trade. But the vast majority of Sumerians were none of these things. They were not kings or priests or scribes or merchants. They were ordinary people, farmers and laborers and craftsmen and herders and fishermen and weavers and their wives and their children and their lives, harder to see in the record but no less real, made up the great living body of the civilization on which everything else rested. Let us try, as best we can, to see them. The ordinary Sumerian lived in a small house of mud brick, in a town or village or in the crowded streets of one of the cities. The house might be a single room or several. If the family was prosperous, it might have a courtyard. The walls were mud brick, plastered. The roof was flat, made of beams and reeds and mud, used as living and sleeping space in the hot months. The floor was packed earth, perhaps with reed mats. There was little furniture. A few stools, perhaps a table, sleeping mats or low beds, chests and jars for storage. The hearth and the oven were the heart of the home. Light came from the doorway, and from small high windows and, at night, from small oil lamps, little dishes of oil with a wick, a dim, flickering, smoky light by which the evening's work, or talk, or rest was carried on. The day began early, with the dawn, for the heat of midday in the southern plain made it necessary to do the hard work in the cool of the morning and the evening, and to rest in the worst of the heat. For the farmer, the day's work followed the season, ploughing, sowing, tending the canals, weeding, watching the water, and, in its season, the frantic labour of the harvest. For the herder, it was the care of the flocks, the sheep that gave the wool that was Sumer's great export, the goats, the cattle. For the fisherman, the nets and the lines and the boats on the rivers and marshes and the gulf. For the craftsman, the workshop and the patient labour of the potter, or the weaver, or the smith, or the carpenter. For the labourer, the canal digging and the brick making and the carrying that the great building projects and the maintenance of the irrigation systems endlessly required. And for the women, for half the population, whose lives are often the hardest to recover, there was an enormous burden of labour, much of it relentless and unending. There was the grinding of the grain, day after day, the kneeling at the saddle quern, pushing the upper stone back and forth over the lower, hour after hour, to make the day's flour, the most universal and most exhausting of all the domestic labours, the one that wore down the bones of the women who did it. Visible in the skeletons archaeologists recover, there was the baking and the cooking and the brewing. There was the spinning and the weaving, for textiles were made in the home as well as in the great workshops, and the spindle and the loom were the constant companions of women's lives. There was the carrying of water, the care of children, the tending of the small livestock and the kitchen garden. The labour of the Sumerian woman was constant. From before dawn to after dark, the invisible foundation on which the household and the whole society rested. But we should not paint the picture as only labour. There was also family, and love, and pleasure, and the rich texture of ordinary human life. And the Sumerians, who wrote so much down, let us glimpse it. There was marriage, and it was the centre of social life. Marriage in Sumer was a contract, often arranged between families, formalized in legal terms with provisions for the dowry and the bride price and the rights of the parties. But the love poetry and the proverbs and the letters show that it was also, often, a matter of affection and tenderness and the ordinary joys and frictions of married life. We have Sumerian love poems of great beauty and frankness. We have proverbs about the troubles and comforts of marriage. We have the records of marriages made and, sometimes, divorces granted. The family, husband, wife, children, often grandparents and other kin under one roof or close by, was the fundamental unit, and the Sumerians valued it deeply. Children were greatly desired, both for love and for the practical reasons that they would work and support their parents in age and, crucially, would make the offerings to the dead that the grey underworld required. To die without children was a kind of catastrophe, a fate the Sumerians dreaded. There were children, and there was childhood, and there were toys, little clay models of animals and carts and people, found in the archaeology, the toys of Sumerian children, played with in the dust of the streets 4,000 years ago. There were games, the board games like the royal game of played by adults and presumably by children, games of chance and skill, the universal games of childhood that need no equipment at all. There was schooling, for the fortunate few, almost always boys, almost always of the better-off families, who were sent to the scribal school, the tablet house, to learn the immense difficult art of cuneiform. We have a wonderful and very human picture of this schooling from the Sumerian texts themselves, the school days texts, which describe the life of the schoolboy. The long days copying tablets, the strict discipline, the beatings administered by the teacher and the monitors for the smallest faults, for being late, for talking, for sloppy writing, for standing up without permission. The boy's complaints, his fear of the cane, and, in one famous text, his father's bribing of the teacher with food and drink and a fine garment to win the teacher's favor and ensure the boy's advancement. Across 4,000 years, the schoolboy dreads the teacher's cane, and the anxious father bribes the schoolmaster to look kindly on his son. The institutions of education, with all their cruelty and all their hope, are as old as civilization itself. There was food and feasting, the staples of barley bread and beer and dates and fish and vegetables that we spoke of, and, on festival days and for the wealthy, the richer fare, the meat and the elaborate dishes of the oldest recipes in the world. The Sumerians loved their beer, and drinking was a social pleasure, often communal. The great jar of beer shared among friends through their reed straws, a scene of conviviality shown again and again in their art and seals. There was music, the lyres and harps and pipes and drums, whose forms we recover even though their melodies are lost. At feasts, at festivals, at funerals, in the temples, the constant accompaniment to the great moments of communal and religious life. There was dancing and singing, and the telling of stories on the long winter evenings. And there was religion, woven through every hour of every day, not as a separate compartment, but as the very fabric of how the world was understood. The ordinary Sumerian lived surrounded by the divine and the demonic, by gods great and small, by protective spirits, and by the malicious demons who were thought to bring sickness and misfortune. Each person had a personal god, a kind of divine guardian, a patron, who looked after the individual's interests among the great gods, to whom one prayed for protection, and whom one might reproach when things went wrong. Sickness, in particular, was understood as the work of demons, or the punishment of an offended god, to be treated by a combination of medicine, and the Sumerians and Babylonians developed a considerable body of practical medical knowledge, with prescriptions and treatments recorded in the tablets, and of magic, incantation, ritual, the driving out of the demon and the placating of the god. The world was charged with unseen powers, helpful and hostile, and ordinary life was, in part, the constant business of staying on the right side of them. The prayers, the offerings, the amulets, the small daily acts of piety and protection that hedged a life around against the dangers of an unpredictable and spirit-haunted world. Life was short, by our standards, and precarious. Disease was common and little understood. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. The famines and floods and wars that periodically swept the plain could destroy a household or a city in a season. Most people did not live to be old. Those who did were honored for it. Death was always close, the grey underworld always waiting, and the brevity and fragility of life lent a particular intensity, perhaps, to its pleasures, to the beer and the love and the music and the warm, crowded life of the household and the city. They knew the dark was coming. The wise woman's advice to Gilgamesh was, in the end, advice for everyone. Fill your belly with good things, cherish the child who holds your hand, let the one who loves you delight in your embrace. This was not just heroic philosophy. It was, surely, the lived wisdom of ordinary people in a hard and beautiful world, making what they could of the brief light they were given, in the streets and the houses and the fields of the first cities on earth. These are the people we most easily forget, the ones who did not build the monuments or write the epics or fill the royal tombs, the ones who appear in the record only as numbers in ration lists, as marks on the worn bones in the grinding house, as the toys of children in the dust. But they were the civilization. The kings and the gods and the temples were the bright crown of it, but the body of it, the great living mass of it, was these ordinary people, getting up before dawn, grinding the grain, tending the water, raising the children, sharing the beer, fearing the demons, loving and quarreling and laboring and dying, generation after generation, on the flat land between the rivers. They are harder to see than the gold, but they are there, and without them there was nothing. No city, no temple, no epic, no Sumer at all. When you remember the Sumerians tonight, remember them too, the woman at the grinding stone, the boy dreading the schoolmaster's cane, the friends sharing beer through reed straws in the warm evening, the child playing with a little clay cart in the dust of the world's first streets. They were here, they were ordinary, and the ordinary in the end is most of what any civilization ever is. In a city of strangers, something has to take the place of the trust that once bound a village together. When you live among people you have known your whole life, who knew your parents and will know your children, the threat of shame and the weight of memory are enough to keep most quarrels in check. But in a city of tens of thousands, where you do not know the man you are trading with, where the field you farm may border the field of someone whose name you have never learned, where the water you share is shared with people you will never meet, something more is needed, some agreed-upon order, some way of settling the inevitable disputes that does not end in blood, some authority that stands above the two parties and can be appealed to by both. The Sumerians built that authority, and then, in time, they wrote it down. And in doing so they gave the world one of its most consequential inventions, not as dramatic as the wheel, not as visible as the city, but in its quiet way just as fundamental. They gave us the written law. We should be careful here, because there is a famous name that tends to crowd out the older one. Most people who know anything about ancient law know the name Hammurabi, the Babylonian king whose great code, carved on a tall black stone now standing in the Louvre, is one of the most famous documents from the ancient world. Hammurabi's laws, with their stern rhythm of, if a man does this, then this shall be done to him, are often called the first laws, the oldest code, the beginning of written justice. They are not. Hammurabi reigned in the 18th century before the Common Era. The Sumerians had been writing down laws for 3 centuries before he was born. The oldest surviving law code we know of was written not in Babylon, but in the Sumerian city of in the name of the king Ur-Nammu, or perhaps his son Shulgi. The scholars debate which, around 2100 before the Common Era, 300 years before Hammurabi, and there were almost certainly older codes still, now lost, of which we have only fragments and references. The code of Ur-Nammu survives only in part, copied onto clay tablets by later scribes, broken and incomplete. But what survives is enough to startle, because the laws of Ur-Nammu are not, for the most part, the laws of an eye for an eye. They are, very often, laws of compensation, laws that set a price, in silver, for an injury, rather than demanding an equal injury in return. If a man knocks out another man's tooth, the later code of Hammurabi will say, knock out his tooth. But the older code of Ur-Nammu says something different. It says, he shall pay so many shekels of silver. The principle is not vengeance, but restitution. The idea that a wrong creates a debt, and the debt can be measured, and the measuring of it is the work of justice. This is, when you sit with it, a remarkably sophisticated idea. It suggests a society that had thought hard about what justice is for, that had decided, at least in some cases, that the point of law was not to satisfy the wounded party's desire for revenge, but to repair the social fabric, to settle the matter, to restore a kind of balance, and let life go on. Whether this made the law more merciful, or merely more useful to the powerful, who could, after all, afford the fines more easily than the poor, is a question worth asking. But the principle itself, the translation of injury into measurable debt, is one of the foundations on which all later law would be built. The code opens, as such documents tended to, with the king presenting himself as the agent of the gods and the protector of the weak. Ur-Nammu declares that he established justice in the land, that he removed the cheats and the grabbers, that he made sure the orphan did not fall prey to the rich and the widow did not fall prey to the powerful, that he saw to it that the man of 1 shekel was not delivered up to the man of 1 mina, the poor man not handed over to the rich. Whether the reality matched the rhetoric we cannot know, but the rhetoric itself is significant. It establishes, at the very dawn of written law, the ideal that the law exists to protect the weak from the strong, an ideal that the strong have been failing to live up to, and the weak have been appealing to, ever since. Beyond the great codes, the daily practice of Sumerian law is visible to us in thousands of ordinary documents, and this is perhaps even more remarkable than the codes themselves, because the Sumerians, having invented writing for accounting, quickly began to use it for law. They wrote contracts, they wrote records of sales, this field, sold by this man to that man, for this price, witnessed by these people, on this date. They wrote loan agreements, specifying the interest and the term. They wrote marriage contracts and adoption contracts and records of inheritance. They wrote down the verdicts of court cases, so that the settlement of a dispute would have a permanent record that could be appealed to if the matter ever arose again. We have, for example, the record of a murder trial, one of the oldest recorded trials in human history. A man was killed, 3 men were accused of the killing, and there was a question of whether the dead man's wife, who had known of the murder and kept silent, should also be punished. The case was referred to the assembly of the city. The arguments were made. Some argued the wife was as guilty as the killers. Others argued that since her husband had failed to provide for her, she had reason to want him dead and should not be condemned. The assembly decided. The killers were condemned, the wife was spared, and a scribe wrote it all down, and the tablet survived. And 4,000 years later we can read the arguments of people quarrelling over guilt and justice in a language no one has spoken for millennia. This is the deep gift of Sumerian law, not just the grand codes carved for the glory of kings, but the ordinary machinery of a society that had decided to settle its disputes with words and witnesses and written records rather than with the blade. The court, the contract, the witnessed agreement, the appeal to a written precedent. These are Sumerian inventions, or near enough, and we live inside them still. Every contract you have ever signed, every receipt you have ever kept, every appeal to what the agreement says, all of it runs back, along the long chain of inheritance, to the scribes of Sumer pressing the terms of a bargain into wet clay and calling witnesses to make their marks beside it. The law did not make the Sumerians good. No law ever has. The records are full of cheating and theft and violence, and the powerful bending the rules to their advantage, as the records of every society in every age are full of these things. But the law gave them something to appeal to, a standard outside the quarrel itself, a measure that both parties could be held to, a way of saying, this is not merely my will against yours, but a matter of what is right, written down, witnessed, agreed. That idea, that justice could be made external, fixed, public, written, was one of the quiet revolutions of the human story, and it happened here, on the flat land between the rivers, in the cities of mud and reed. Look at a clock. Look at the way it divides the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds. Look at the way a circle is divided into 360 degrees. Look at the 12 hours on the face, the 12 months of your year, the way the compass turns through its 360 degrees back to where it began. All of this, the architecture of how you measure time and angle and the turning of the heavens, is a Sumerian inheritance. You carry it on your wrist. You glance at it a dozen times a day, and almost no one who reads the time knows that they are reading it in a system devised more than 5,000 years ago by people counting with reeds on the banks of 2 rivers. The Sumerians counted, for reasons that are still debated, in a system based on 60. We count in tens, almost certainly because we have 10 fingers, and counting on the fingers is the oldest arithmetic there is. The Sumerians used 10 as well, but they wove it together with 60 into a system that modern scholars call sexagesimal. Why 60? There are theories. 60 is a wonderfully convenient number. It can be divided evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, which makes it marvelous for trade and measurement and the splitting of quantities into equal shares. A number that divides so many ways is a gift to a society doing constant practical arithmetic, dividing rations, splitting fields, reckoning interest, measuring grain. Perhaps the Sumerians chose 60, consciously or not, because it made the daily arithmetic of a complex economy easier. Perhaps it grew from some older method of counting on the finger joints with the thumb. We do not fully know, but the choice, once made, has outlasted everything else about them. From this base 60 counting, the Sumerians built a mathematics of real sophistication. They developed something that took most of the rest of the world thousands of additional years to discover independently: the place value system. This is the idea, so familiar to us that we cannot see how strange and powerful it is, that the same symbol means different things depending on where it sits. In our numbers, the 2 in 20 means something different from the 2 in 200 because of its position. The Sumerians grasped this principle. The value of a sign depended on its place. This is the foundation of all efficient calculation, and they had it in their own base 60 form before almost anyone else on Earth. With it, they could do remarkable things. They computed areas and volumes, necessary work for a people forever digging canals, building walls, surveying fields, and reckoning how much earth must be moved or how much grain a granary would hold. They worked with fractions. They produced multiplication tables and tables of reciprocals and tables of squares and cubes, copied out by students learning the craft. They could solve what we would call algebraic problems, problems about unknown quantities, the length and width of a field given its area, and the difference of its sides. There survived tablets, showing that they understood, in practice, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle that we name after Pythagoras, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They were not proving theorems in the Greek manner, with abstract logical demonstration. They were calculating, practically, brilliantly, for the work of running a world. But the knowledge was real, and it was deep, and they turned their numbers to the sky. The flat land between the rivers, you will remember, has an enormous sky, unbroken, vast, wheeling with stars in the dry, clear nights. We have already stood under it in the streets of Ur. The Sumerians and the Babylonians who came after them watched that sky with a patience and a precision that built, over centuries, into the first true science of the heavens. They were not idle stargazers. They watched the sky because they believed it spoke, that the movements of the moon and the planets and the patterns of the stars were messages from the gods, signs that a trained observer could learn to read. Astronomy and astrology were, for them, the same thing, the careful study of the heavens in order to understand the will of the divine and the shape of things to come. But in the service of that belief, they did real and lasting science. They tracked the movements of the moon with such care that they could predict its phases and, in time, eclipses. They identified the planets that wander against the fixed stars and tracked their motions and kept records, night after night, year after year, generation after generation, of where each one stood. They divided the band of sky through which the sun and moon and planets move into segments marked by constellations, the ancestor of the zodiac you still see in the newspaper. They worked out a calendar based on the moon, with months that began at the first sighting of the new crescent, and they devised ways to keep that lunar calendar in step with the solar year and its seasons by adding extra months when needed. The records they kept, the long, patient, accumulating tables of observations, became, over the centuries, a treasure of data that later astronomers, Greek and beyond, would draw upon and build upon. The Sumerians and their Mesopotamian heirs laid the empirical foundation, the long baseline of careful observation, on which the later mathematical astronomy of the ancient world was raised. When Greek astronomers calculated the motions of the heavens, they were standing on a mountain of Babylonian observation that ran back, in its origins, to the Sumerian watchers of the plain. And so the division of the circle into 360 degrees, close to the number of days in the year, and conveniently divisible in the base 60 way, comes down to us from them. The 60 minutes and 60 seconds, the 12-fold divisions, the very habit of measuring the sky in degrees and the time in 60ths. We inherited the bones of our timekeeping and our geometry from people who measured the turning year by the thin new moon over the flat horizon and wrote their numbers with a reed in clay. Every time you say it is half past, every time you set an angle or read a compass bearing or count the seconds, you are speaking, without knowing it, a language first spoken in Sumer. For almost all of human history, the people who made our oldest stories are nameless. The great myths, the epics, the hymns of the early world come down to us as the work of anonymous tradition, composed by no one in particular, shaped by countless hands and voices over countless generations, attributed, when they are attributed at all, to gods or to legend. We do not know who first told the tale of Gilgamesh. We do not know who composed the great hymns to the gods of Sumer. They are the work of the culture itself, of no single hand. And then, out of that long anonymity, a single name emerges. The first name in all of literary history that we can attach to an actual author. A person who composed specific works, signed them, spoke of herself within them, and was remembered by name. The name is Enheduanna, and she was a woman. This fact alone should give us pause. The first author whose name we know, the first individual in the whole human record who stands up out of the anonymous chorus and says, in effect, I made this, these are my words, was a Sumerian woman who lived around 2,300 years before the Common Era, more than 4,300 years ago. She predates Homer by some 16 centuries. She predates the writers of the Hebrew scriptures, the Greek poets, the named authors of every later tradition. She stands at the very head of the long line of everyone who has ever written anything and put their name to it, and she has, until very recently, been almost entirely forgotten by the world that inherited the thing she helped to begin. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the great conqueror whose story we will come to shortly. Her father, having brought the cities of Sumer under his rule, appointed her to one of the most important religious offices in the land, high priestess of the moon god Nanna at the great temple in Ur. We have stood in that city already, you and I, under that enormous southern sky, beside the ziggurat where the moon god was thought to dwell. Enheduanna served there, in the highest sacred office a woman could hold, for decades. And she wrote, What she wrote were hymns, sacred poems addressed to the gods. The greatest of them, and the one most fully recovered, is a long and extraordinary poem addressed to the goddess Inanna, whom we have met before in her terrible doubleness, goddess of love and of war, the morning and evening star. The poem is sometimes called, from its opening words, the exaltation of Inanna, and it is not the cool, formal, impersonal hymn we might expect from the dawn of literature. It is intensely, startlingly personal, because Enheduanna, it seems, fell from power. There was a rebellion. A usurper drove her from her sacred office in and forced her into exile. And in her great poem to Inanna, she cries out from that exile. She describes her suffering, her expulsion from the temple, the man who has wronged her, her desperate appeal to the goddess to restore her. She speaks of herself by name. She says, in effect, "I am Enheduanna. This has been done to me. Hear me, great goddess, and set it right." The poem moves from grand cosmic praise of the goddess's terrifying power to the raw, particular voice of a real woman in real trouble, calling on her divine patroness across the gulf of her despair. This is something genuinely new in the human record. Not a story told about gods and heroes by an anonymous tradition, but the voice of a named individual, speaking of her own experience, her own suffering, her own faith, in words she shaped herself and signed with her own name. It is the birth of authorship, the birth of the idea that a text can be the work of a particular person, expressing a particular inner life. Everything that we mean by literature, in the fullest sense, the personal voice, the signed work, the individual standing behind the words, begins, as far as our records can show, with her. And there is a further wonder in it. In the poem, Enheduanna reflects on the very act of composing, on the labor of giving birth to these words, on the difficulty and the holiness of the work of making a hymn worthy of the goddess. She is, at the dawn of writing, already conscious of writing as a craft, a struggle, an offering. She knows what she is doing is hard and significant. She is, in the truest sense, the first writer who writes about writing. We do not know, in the end, whether the goddess heard her, whether Enheduanna was restored to her office, whether the poem worked the magic it pleaded for. The historical record is too thin, but the words survived, copied and recopied by scribes for centuries after her death, treasured and studied in the schools of Mesopotamia long after the woman herself was dust. Her hymns were classics, taught, admired, preserved, for the better part of 1,000 years. She was remembered, in her own world, as a great figure. It was only the later forgetting of Sumer itself, the long burial of the whole civilization, that buried her name along with everything else. And now she is coming back. As the tablets are read and the hymns are reassembled and translated, the first author in human history is taking her place again at the head of the long procession of all who write, a Sumerian princess and priestess, daughter of the first emperor, who served the moon god in the great city of who fell from power and cried out to her goddess in poetry, and who, in doing so, became the first human being we can name, who turned the new and miraculous technology of writing toward the most human of all purposes, the expression of a single soul. She was here. Her name was Enheduanna. Remember it as you drift toward sleep. The first author, a woman, from Sumer. For most of the story we have told, Sumer was not one thing. It was many, a scatter of rival city-states, each with its own god and its own king and its own walls, quarreling endlessly over water and land and pride, sometimes uniting briefly under one strong city, more often fighting. We have walked through that quarrelsome world, Uruk against Lagash against the kingship passing restlessly from city to city, no single power holding the whole land for long. For more than 1,000 years this was the shape of things. The idea that all the cities of the plain, and the lands beyond them, might be gathered under a single ruler, a single throne, a single empire, was not yet in the world. And then came a man who put it there. His name, in the language he spoke, was something like Sharukan, which means the king is legitimate, or the true king. A name that smells of propaganda, of a man insisting on a right that perhaps he did not inherit. We know him as Sargon of Akkad, and around 2,334 years before the Common Era, give or take, he did something no one had done before. He conquered all the cities of Sumer, and the lands around them, and welded them into the first empire in the history of the world. The story of his origins, as the later tradition told it, has a shape you may find strangely familiar. Sargon, the legend says, was not born to power, His mother was a priestess, who bore him in secret and could not keep him, so she made a basket of reeds, the reeds of the marsh, which we have seen woven into the very fabric of Sumerian life, and she sealed it with pitch, so it would float, and she laid the infant inside it, and she set the basket upon the river, and let the water carry him away. The river bore him downstream until a man drawing water found the basket and lifted the child out and raised him as his own. And from that foundling beginning, the legend says, the abandoned baby of the river rose to become the master of the world. Or if that story tugs at something in your memory, it should. Centuries later, the same shape, the infant of uncertain birth, set adrift on the river in a basket sealed against the water, drawn out and raised to greatness, would be told of a baby named Moses, floating among the reeds of the Nile. Whether the one tale descends from the other, or whether both draw from some still older common well of story, scholars debate. But the Sargon legend is far older. The shape of that story, the saved child of the river who becomes a deliverer, was being told in Mesopotamia long before it was told beside the Nile. It is one more of the deep channels along which the imagination of Sumer flowed forward into the traditions that would shape the Western world. The historical Sargon, behind the legend, was a formidable man. He seems to have begun as an official in the service of a Sumerian king, and to have seized power for himself, and then to have turned his ambition outward with a relentless energy. He conquered the Sumerian cities one by one. He marched his armies far beyond the plain, into the lands to the north and west, toward the Mediterranean, toward the Cedar Mountains and the Silver Mountains, toward the upper reaches of the rivers. He boasted, in his inscriptions, of the vast territories he had brought under his rule, of the ships of distant lands that docked at the quay of his capital, of the daily thousands who ate before him. That capital was the city of Agard, somewhere on the plain, a city whose exact location is, remarkably, still lost to us. It has never been certainly found. From Akkad, Sargon and his successors ruled an empire that for the first time bound the whole of Mesopotamia, Sumer in the south, and the Akkadian-speaking lands in the north, under one crown. He installed his own officials in the conquered cities. He appointed his own daughter, Enheduanna, whom we have just met, to the highest priesthood in binding the religious authority of the old Sumerian heartland to his new dynasty. He standardized, he organized, he projected power across distances no ruler before him had commanded. And in doing so he changed the language of the land. Sargon and his people spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language, related to the later Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic, utterly different in its roots from Sumerian. Under the empire of Akkad, Akkadian rose to become the language of power, the language of rule, spreading across the cities of the plain. Sumerian did not die. It remained the sacred and learned tongue, the language of the temples and the old traditions. But from this point on, the two languages lived side by side, and slowly, over the centuries to come, Akkadian would win the daily life of Mesopotamia, while Sumerian retreated into the schools and the rituals, like Latin in later Europe. The empire of Sargon was the hinge on which that long turning began. The empire of Akkad did not last. Empires rarely do. After Sargon and his sons and his grandson, the grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled gloriously and then saw the realm begin to fray, the empire weakened, beset by internal revolt and by the pressure of peoples from the mountains to the east. The later Mesopotamian tradition remembered the fall of Akkad as a kind of divine punishment, a great curse called down upon the city for the impiety of its kings, and a haunting poem, The Curse of Akkad, tells of the once glorious city brought to ruin and desolation, its canals empty, its streets silent, the gods having turned their faces away. The lost city was so thoroughly destroyed, or abandoned, that to this day we cannot find it. But the idea of empire did not die with Akkad. Sargon had shown that it could be done, that the cities of the plain could be gathered into one, that a single throne could rule from the lower sea to the upper, that the scattered quarrel of the city-states could be replaced, at least for a time, by a single order. Every empire that would later rise in Mesopotamia, the great revival of that came next, and after it Babylon, and after it Assyria, and on through the Persians and beyond, was building on the model that Sargon first cut into the world. He was the first emperor, the foundling of the reed basket, the man who named himself the true king, who rose from the river to gather the cities of Sumer and Akkad into the first empire the earth had ever seen. He too was here, and the shape of his ambition has never quite left us. After the empire of Akkad crumbled, the land between the rivers passed through a confused and shadowed age, a time of weakness, of incursion by mountain peoples from the east, of broken authority and uncertain memory. But out of that darkness came one last great flowering of specifically Sumerian power and culture, the final brilliant age before the Sumerian world faded for good. Historians call it the third dynasty of Ur, or simply Ur the Third. To the people who lived in it, it must have felt like a restoration. The old gods honored again, the old language exalted, the great city of Ur risen once more to rule the plain. It began with a king named Ur-Nammu, around 2112 before the Common Era. He gathered the cities of Sumer back under the rule of Ur, the city we have walked through, with its ziggurat and its moon god, and its harbour, and its narrow winding streets, and under Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, who reigned long and gloriously after him, Ur became the centre of a kingdom that, while smaller than Sargon's sprawling empire, was more tightly, more intricately, more astonishingly organized than anything that had come before. Ur-Nammu was a great builder. It was he who raised, or rebuilt to its greatest height, the enormous ziggurat of Ur whose ruins still stand today. That mountain of mud brick rising in stepped terraces above the flat plain, the staircase to the dwelling of the moon god, the most complete and famous of all the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. When you picture a ziggurat, you are almost certainly picturing his. He built temples across the land, dug and repaired canals, and, as we have seen, set his name to the oldest surviving code of law, establishing himself in the ancient ideal of the just king who protects the weak and removes the cheat. But it was under his son Shulgi that the kingdom of Ur reached its strange and dazzling height. Shulgi reigned for nearly half a century, and he seems to have been one of the most remarkable administrators in the whole of the ancient world. Under him, the kingdom of Ur became a bureaucratic machine of a complexity that staggers the modern mind. The scribes of Ur recorded everything, and I mean nearly everything. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets survive from this single dynasty, documenting the movement of goods and labor and livestock through the kingdom in obsessive, exhaustive, almost suffocating detail. We have records of the dead animals received at a great central clearinghouse, sorted and tallied and redistributed. We have records of laborers and their work assignments and their rations, day by day. We have records of how much a given worker was expected to produce and what happened when they fell short. For the system kept running accounts of labor owed, of deficits carried over, of the debts that the living owed to the state and that, in some grim cases, were inherited by their survivors after they died. This was a command economy of formidable reach, run by an army of scribes, measuring the productive life of an entire kingdom in marks pressed into clay. It is a vision of order, almost frightening in its thoroughness. The human energy of a whole society channeled, counted, and accounted for. There is something in the bureaucracy of Ur that feels uncannily modern, uncannily like the great administrative states of much later ages. And there is something, too, that feels like a kind of overreach. A system stretched so tight, so dependent on central control and constant accounting, that one wonders how much weight it could bear before something gave way. Shulgi himself was exalted beyond ordinary kingship. Like some of the kings of Akkad before him, he was declared a god in his own lifetime. Temples raised to him, offerings made to him, hymns sung in his praise. He boasted, in those hymns, of his accomplishments with a confidence that is almost charming in its excess. He was the swift runner, the wise scribe who could read and write, the just judge, the mighty warrior, the skilled musician, the perfect king who excelled at everything. Whether the man matched the hymns we cannot say, but the hymns themselves tell us that this was an age that believed in itself, an age that thought it had achieved a kind of perfection of order, a final and stable flowering of the Sumerian world. And it was a great cultural age as well as a great administrative one. Under the third dynasty of Ur, the old Sumerian literature was gathered and copied and preserved with new energy. Many of the great Sumerian literary works that survive to us, the hymns, the myths, the king lists, the laments, much of what we know of Sumerian thought and story, come down to us in copies made in this period or in the schools that grew from it. It was a renaissance, in the true sense, a deliberate looking back to and revival of the old Sumerian heritage, even as the spoken language of daily life was increasingly Akkadian. Sumerian was becoming, more and more, the language of the learned and the sacred, the tongue of the schools and the temples and the great old literature, while the streets spoke Akkadian. Ur the Third was, in a sense, the great age of Sumerian as a classical language, lovingly preserved by the very people among whom it was ceasing to be a mother tongue. But the tightness of the system, the dependence on central control, the long accumulation of pressures within and enemies without, all of it was building toward a reckoning. The kingdom of for all its dazzling order, for all its hundreds of thousands of meticulous tablets, for all its god-kings and its great ziggurat and its preserved and treasured literature, was the last full flowering of the Sumerian world. After it, the specifically Sumerian age of Mesopotamia would close, and the closing, when it came, would be remembered in one of the most heartbreaking poems the ancient world ever produced. Every civilization believes, somewhere in its heart, that it will last. Not forever, perhaps. Even the Sumerians knew that all things end, that the gods alone are deathless and human works are clay. But there is a kind of assumption built into the daily life of any thriving society that tomorrow will be much like today, that the city will stand, that the temple will receive its offerings, that the children will inherit the world their parents knew, and then, sometimes, that assumption breaks. The unthinkable arrives. The city falls. Around 2004 years before the Common Era, after a little more than a century of its dazzling order, the kingdom of the third dynasty of came to its end. The pressures had been mounting for years. Famine, the breakdown of the overstretched administrative system, the steady infiltration of the Amorite peoples from the western desert, who pressed into the settled lands in growing numbers. The last king of Ibisin, watched his kingdom contract around him, city after city slipping from his control, the great machine of Shulgi's bureaucracy seizing and failing. And then the final blow came from the east, from Elam, the old rival kingdom in the mountains of what is now western Iran. The Elamites and their allies marched on broke into the great city, sacked it, burned it, and carried the last king away into captivity, never to return. To us, reading the bare facts at 4,000 years' distance, it is one more sack of one more city in the long, bloody catalogue of the ancient world. But the Sumerians did not let it pass in silence. They did something extraordinary with their grief. They wrote it down. They composed a long, formal, shattering poem, the lament for the destruction of to mourn the fall of the great city. And it is one of the oldest expressions of civic grief in human literature, the ancestor of every lament for a fallen city that would ever be written, from the laments over Jerusalem in the Hebrew scriptures to the elegies of every later age for every later ruin. The lament imagines the catastrophe as the work of the gods, for in the Sumerian understanding, nothing happened without the will of the gods, and even the destruction of the holiest city must be, in some terrible sense, divinely decreed. The poem tells how the great gods of the assembly turned against how they called down the storm that is the recurring image of the poem, the great destroying wind that sweeps over the land and lays it waste. And it describes, in unflinching detail, what that storm left behind. It describes the bodies in the streets and the canals. It describes the smoke rising from the burning city, the buildings thrown down, the walls breached, the temple defiled. It describes the people cut down or scattered, the families torn apart, the dead lying unburied where they fell. It describes the silence where there had been the noise of a living city, the empty sheepfolds, the abandoned houses, the canals running with what should not run in canals. It is a vision of total desolation, rendered with a power that loses almost nothing across 4,000 years. And at the heart of the poem stands the goddess of the city, Ningal, the wife of the moon god Nana, the divine lady of The lament gives her a voice. It lets her grieve. It describes how she pleaded with the great gods to spare her city, how she wept and begged before the assembly, how she could not save it, and how she wandered through the ruins of her own destroyed home, mourning. The goddess weeping over her fallen city, the divine mother grieving for her lost children, walking through the ashes of the place that was hers, is one of the most affecting images the ancient world produced. It is grief raised to the cosmic scale, and grief brought down to the most intimate. A mother who has lost everything, walking through the wreckage, unable to bear what she sees. The lament is not only sorrow, though. Like much Sumerian literature, it bends at the end toward restoration, a prayer that the storm be lifted, that the city be rebuilt, that the gods relent and return, and that life flow back into And in fact, was not destroyed forever. The city was resettled. It lived on for many centuries more, under other rulers, other languages, other gods, until at last the rivers shifted and the trade routes moved and the city was abandoned and buried, to wait for Woolley and his spade, thousands of years later. But the kingdom of the great Sumerian dynasty, the last full flowering of the Sumerian world, was finished, and with it, slowly, the Sumerian age itself drew toward its close, for this is the deeper ending that the fall of Ur marks. After this, the political world of Mesopotamia belonged to others, to the Amorites who founded Babylon, to the Assyrians of the north, to the long succession of empires that would rule the land in the millennia to come. The Sumerian language, already retreating in the age of Ur III, slipped further and further from daily life, until it was spoken by no one as a mother tongue at all, preserved only in the schools and the temples, a learned and sacred language, studied and copied, and used in ritual long after the last child had ceased to lisp it at home. Like Latin in medieval Europe, Sumerian became the dead language of the educated and the holy, kept alive by scribes who learned it as a discipline, used in the old prayers and the old literature, honored, studied, but no longer living on any human tongue. And there is a slow, quiet, almost invisible villain in this long fading too. The one we glimpsed far back at the beginning, in the fields, the salt, the relentless salinization of the southern soil, the slow poisoning of the great fields by the very irrigation that had made them fertile, the gradual shift from wheat to the more salt-tolerant barley, and then the decline even of that, the white crust creeping across the once rich land, the heartland of Sumer, the deep south where the first cities had risen, grew slowly less able to feed great populations. The center of gravity of Mesopotamian life shifted north, toward Babylon and beyond. The old southern cities, one by one, declined. The land that had given birth to civilization grew old and tired and salt-bitten, and the great age it had nourished passed, like the storm in the lament, and did not return. We have come a long way, you and I, across the flat land between the rivers. We have stood at the dawn of the first cities, and walked the streets of Ur. We have watched writing born from the need to count, and law from the need to settle quarrels, and number and time and the measure of the heavens take the shapes we still use. We have met the gods and the kings and the first author with a name, and the first emperor, and the last great flowering, and the long sad fading. And now, before we let the story go and turn towards sleep, we should pause and ask the question that hangs over the whole of it. What did it matter? What did these people, on this flat plain, gone for 4,000 years, their language dead, their cities buried, leave to the world that came after? What of Sumer is still with us tonight? The honest answer is, more than almost any other people who ever lived, because the Sumerians did not merely build a civilization, they built, in a sense, the idea of civilization, the basic kit of tools and institutions and concepts on which nearly every complex society since has been built, knowingly or not. So much of what we take for granted as simply the way human life is organized was, somewhere on that plane, done for the first time. The city itself, the dense, permanent gathering of strangers, the place where most of humanity now lives, was, as far as we know, invented here. Writing, the technology that allows a thought to outlast the thinker, that holds lore and story and account and memory and marks that endure, was invented here, or in one of the very few places on Earth where it was independently born. And the Mesopotamian invention is the oldest we can trace. The school, the scribe, the written record, the contract, the receipt, the witnessed agreement, all here. The written law code, the court, the appeal to justice external and fixed and public, here. The wheel turned for transport, and the potter's wheel, and the plough that opens the earth, and the sailing boat that catches the wind, all in use here, among the earliest anywhere. The arch and the vault and the column in architecture, the division of time into 60s, the circle into 360 degrees, the year into 12, the systematic watching of the heavens that became astronomy, large-scale irrigation, and the management of water by cooperative human effort, the temple, the bureaucracy, the standing institution that outlives the individuals who staff it, bread and beer. The list of human firsts that runs back to Sumer is so long that it is easier to say what of our basic civilization does not, in some way, trace to them. But the legacy runs deeper than the list of inventions and closer to home than most people realize. For the stories of Sumer did not die with the Sumerian language. They flowed onward, translated into Akkadian, retold in Babylon, carried along the trade routes and the migrations and the slow seepage of cultures into one another, and some of them flowed, eventually, into the book that has shaped the Western world more than any other. The Hebrew Bible carries, deep in its early chapters, the unmistakable signature of Mesopotamia. We have already touched these echoes as we passed them. the great flood that destroys the world, the one righteous man warned to build a vessel, the saving of life 2 by 2, the bird sent out to find dry land, the boat coming to rest on a mountain as the waters fall. That story was old in Sumer, told of the flood hero whom Gilgamesh sought at the edge of the world, more than 1,000 years before it was told of Noah. The Garden of Paradise, the land of innocence and plenty, the Sumerians dreamed of Dilmun, the pure and shining land where there was no sickness and no death, and the echo of that dream runs into the Garden of Eden. The making of the first human beings from clay by the hands of the gods, a Sumerian image, the long-lived patriarchs before the flood, living hundreds of years the shadow of the Sumerian king list, with its antediluvian rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years before the waters came, the tower raised to heaven, and the confusion of tongues, the memory perhaps of the great ziggurats of the plain, those mountains of brick reaching toward the dwellings of the gods, and of a land where many languages met and mingled. The baby set adrift on the river in a sealed basket and drawn out to become a deliverer, told of Sargon long before it was told of Moses. None of this means the later traditions simply copied the older ones in any simple way. The borrowing, where it happened, was transformation as much as transmission. The old images taken up and turned to wholly new purposes, made to mean new things, woven into a different vision of God and humanity and the world. But the deep channels were cut in Sumer. The imagination of the Western world, when it reaches back to its oldest stories, the flood, the garden, the clay-formed first people, the great tower, the river-saved child, is reaching back, whether it knows it or not, to the flat land between the two rivers. Sumer is one of the hidden headwaters of our oldest dreams, and the chain of transmission is itself part of the story. Sumer flowed into Babylon, and Babylon preserved and elaborated the Sumerian heritage, even as it spoke a different tongue. Babylon flowed into the wider ancient Near East, into the world of the Assyrians and the Persians and the Hebrews and, eventually, the Greeks. The Greeks took up the Babylonian astronomy and mathematics, those long Mesopotamian baselines of observation, that base 60 measure of the sky, and built upon them. And from the Greeks and the Hebrews together, by the long winding road of history, the inheritance came down into the civilization that became our own. We are, in this deep sense, the distant heirs of Sumer, not by blood, not by language, but by the long unbroken chain of borrowed and transformed and transmitted ideas that connects the scribes of Uruk to the screen you are perhaps holding now, the screen on which these very words are letters, marks that outlast the hand, descendants 10,000 times removed of the first marks that someone pressed into wet clay to remember how much grain had come into the temple store. The land between the rivers is still there. This is, as it was for that other island civilization, the most obvious thing that can be said, and, when you sit with it, one of the most moving. The two rivers still flow, the Tigris and the Euphrates, down out of the northern mountains and across the long flat plain toward the sea, though their courses have shifted over the millennia, and the cities they once nourished stand now far from the water that gave them life. The land is the country we call Iraq, with parts spilling into Syria and Turkey and Kuwait. People live there still, have lived there, without interruption, since before the first cities rose. The flat plain still stretches under that same enormous sky. The marshes, in the far south, drained and devastated in recent times, now partly restored, still grow their reeds, and people still build with them, weaving the tall reeds into houses and boats in ways that would be recognized by a marsh dweller of 5,000 years ago. But the cities of Sumer are gone back into the earth they were made of. This is the strange fate of a civilization built of mud. The Egyptians built in stone, and their pyramids and temples still stand against the sky, visible from miles away, impossible to forget. The Sumerians built in clay and reed, and when their cities were abandoned, the rain and the wind and the years melted them slowly back down into the plain from which they had risen. The great cities became low mounds, tells, swelling gently above the flat land, made of the dissolved and compacted remains of all those mud bricks, all those collapsed walls, all those generations of building and rebuilding on the same spot. For thousands of years they sat there, anonymous hills in an empty landscape, with no one remembering what slept beneath them. We have already told how they were found again, the long forgetting, and then the diggers of the 19th and 20th centuries who opened the mounds and read the broken script and gave Sumer back to the world. The great ziggurat of still rises from the plain, restored in part, a mountain of ancient brick under the open sky, the one Sumerian monument that anyone can still stand before and crane their neck at, much as a worshipper of the moon god might have done 4,000 years ago. The museums of the world hold the treasures, the gold of the royal tombs, the lyres and the headdresses, and the standard of the tablets in their tens and hundreds of thousands, the seals, the statues, the long, patient record of a civilization speaking again after its long silence. It has not been a gentle recent history for the land between the rivers, or for the things its ancient people made. War has swept across it again and again in our own time. Museums have been looted, sites have been dug into by thieves seeking treasures to sell, ancient tells have been damaged by the machinery of modern conflict, and objects that survived 4,000 years in the ground have vanished into private hands in the span of a few violent days. The men and women who care for this heritage, Iraqi and foreign alike, have fought, sometimes at the cost of their lives, to protect it. The story of Sumer's rediscovery is not finished, and not all of it is hopeful. Much has been saved, much has been lost, much still sleeps in the mounds, waiting, as it has waited for millennia, for hands gentle enough and times peaceful enough to lift it back into the light. And yet the deepest thing about Sumer is not in the museums or the mounds at all. It is in us. It is in the city you may live in, the writing you are reading, the clock on your wall, the law you appeal to, the week you keep, the wheel that turns under every vehicle that moves, the old stories that lie beneath the stories you were told as a child. The Sumerians are not only in Iraq, under the tells, behind the museum glass. They are woven invisibly through the daily fabric of nearly every human life on Earth. They were the first to do so much of what we still do, that to live a modern human life is, in 100 unnoticed ways, to live inside their inheritance. They were the first. That is what it comes to, in the end. Before Greece, before Rome, before Egypt had built its great pyramids, before the Hebrew scriptures, before almost everything that we think of as the ancient foundations of our world, there was Sumer, on the flat land between the rivers, inventing the very idea of the kind of life we live. They did not inherit civilization from anyone. There was no one to inherit it from. They looked at their hard and generous land, its mud and its reeds, its 2 great rivers, its enormous sky, its terrible floods and its rich black silt, and out of it, with nothing to copy and no one to follow, they built the first cities, the first writing, the first laws, the first epics, the first of so much that we still cannot imagine our lives without. And then they were forgotten, utterly, for thousands of years. Their name was lost, their language fell silent, their cities melted into the plain. The world that they had founded went on without remembering the people who had founded it, the way a grown man goes on without remembering the first faltering words he learnt to speak as an infant. For 2,000 years, no one on earth knew that Sumer had ever existed. And then, marks in clay, the very thing they had invented to defeat forgetting, gave them back. The writing they made to outlast the hand, outlasted the hand by 5,000 years, outlasted the cities and the language and the gods and the very memory of the people, and spoke again, and said, "We were here." That is the thought to carry down into sleep tonight. Not the kings, not the wars, not the rise and fall of dynasties on the plain, just the astonishing, quiet fact of their existence and of their firstness, on a flat plain between 2 rivers, in the deep morning of the world, when most of humankind still lived in villages and the great human adventure of the city had not yet begun anywhere on earth. A people gathered themselves together and built something that had never been built before, and the marks they pressed into the soft clay of their world are the reason we can know it. Let us go back, now, the way we came. Let the cities sink gently back into the plain. Let the dynasties fade, the laments fall silent, the kings and the priests and the scribes lie down. Let the gold go back into the dark of the royal tombs, and the lyres fall still. Let the great ziggurat stand alone under the stars, as it stands tonight, in the actual world, on the actual plain, in the country we now call Iraq, a mountain of ancient brick under the wheeling sky. Picture that sky again, the one we stood under in the streets of so long ago now, at the beginning of this long night's story. The enormous, unbroken sky of the flat land, blazing with more stars than you have ever seen, the moon riding clear and bright across it, the moon they thought a god, sailing in his boat of light over the sleeping plain, the rivers murmuring somewhere in the dark, the reeds whispering at the water's edge, the smell of the mud, the river smell, the smell out of which the whole world of Sumer was made. The people are sleeping, the lamps are out in the courtyard houses, the grinding stones are still, the schoolboy is asleep, his fear of the morning's cane gone soft in dreams. The friends who shared the beer have gone home through the dark winding streets. The woman who ground the grain has lain down at last. The child has fallen asleep with the little clay cart still in one hand. The watchman on the temple looks up at the stars and reads in them the will of the gods and keeps his quiet vigil over the first city in the world. They are all gone now, of course, gone these 4,000 years and more. Their names, almost all of them, lost, their voices silent, but they were here. They lived on this plain, between these rivers, under this sky. They built the world we live in, and then they slept, as you are about to sleep, and the river ran on past them in the dark, carrying its silt down toward the sea, laying down, grain by grain, the soft new land of some city not yet dreamed. Tell me, if you would, before you go, where are you, tonight? What is the night like, where you are listening? Is it warm or cold? Is there rain on the window, or wind, or the deep stillness of a quiet hour? Can you see, from where you lie, any small piece of that same old sky? Any star, any sliver of that moon they once thought a god? Leave a word below, if you like, because somewhere out there, all around the turning world, under skies of every color, other people are lying in the dark as you are, listening to this same old story, carried to all of us out of the mud and the reeds and the marks in the clay. It is a good thing to remember that we are not alone in the dark, that we are all, tonight, lying down under the same stars that shone over Sumer. The story is yours now. Carry it down with you into sleep. The rivers are still flowing, the reeds are still whispering at the water's edge, the marks are still pressed in the clay, holding their 5,000-year-old words, waiting patiently in the dark of the museums and the mounds for the next pair of eyes. And the moon, their moon, the god of the city of the bright boat sailing over the flat dark plain, the moon is still there, sailing on through the sky above you, exactly as it sailed above them. It always will be. Sleep now. Carry the story with you. The rivers will still be flowing in the morning.